Somewhere beneath the surface of our oceans, rivers, and seas, the past is waiting to be rediscovered. Ancient cities swallowed by the tides, shipwrecks carrying fortunes beyond imagination, geological formations that defy all explanation, and creatures so strange they seem to belong to another world entirely. The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet's surface, and yet we have explored less than 20% of it. What lies in the remaining depths is a question that has haunted explorers, scientists, historians, and dreamers for thousands of years. And perhaps no mystery has captured the human imagination more powerfully, more persistently, or more passionately than the legend of a civilization so advanced, so magnificent, so utterly extraordinary that its destruction still echoes across the millennia. We are talking, of course, about Atlantis, but this is not simply about one lost city. This is the story of lost worlds that time and water have swallowed whole. This is the story of the ships that rose and fell before recorded history even began, of the ships that carried empires across the seas only to be claimed by the ocean floor, of the natural wonders that exist in places no human eye has ever seen, and of the dedicated, passionate, sometimes obsessed men and women who have devoted their lives to pulling these secrets back from the deep. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to journey to the bottom of the ocean and to the edge of human knowledge. We are going to explore sunken cities on the floor of the Mediterranean Sea, carved stone structures beneath the waters of the Caribbean, a mysterious circular formation in the middle of the Sahara Desert and the frozen shores of Antarctica. We are crushing dark thermal vents for heated water and where creatures live that should not, by any reasonable scientific understanding, be able to survive at all. And we are going to treasure ever recovered from the sea floor, a fortune in gold and silver and emeralds that lay on the bottom of the ocean for over 300 years before one remarkable man refused to stop looking for it. So take a deep breath. The water is rising and the journey begins now. Let us start at the very beginning. Started everything, the legend of Atlantis. And to understand the legend properly, we need to go back to where it all began, not with some ancient tablet, not with the mysterious inscription carved into a cave wall, but with one of the most celebrated and influential thinkers in the entire history of human civilization. We need to go back to Plato. Plato was born in Athens around 428 BCE, and over the course he produced some of the most philosophical writings ever seen. He is the reason we still think about justice and beauty and the nature ways that we do. He is the father of what we call Western philosophy, and his influence on science, politics, ethics, and art is so vast and so deep that it is almost impossible to fully measure. But among all the extraordinary things Plato wrote and taught and believed, perhaps none has had a longer shadow than a story he included in 2 of his dialogues, works known as the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BCE. In these dialogues, Plato describes a conversation in which an Athenian named Solon is told a tale by beasts. The priest characterizes ancient records go beyond the memory of describe a great nation that existed 9,000 before their own time, an empire that sat in the ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is what the ancient world called the Altar. This civilization, the priests tell Solon, was a naval power of sophistication. Its people were the descendants of Poseidon himself. They had built a magnificent capital city on a series of concentric rings of land and water, a city of gleaming temples and vast harbors, of exotic animals including elephants, of metals and minerals found nowhere else on Earth, of a society so wealthy that it had launched a military campaign to conquer the entire Mediterranean world. Only the priest's claim had stood against this empire and defeated it. And then in a single terrible day and night, the gods had for their arrogance, and the entire beneath the sea. Gone, swallowed whole, lost waves of what Plato called the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the debate over whether Plato intended this story as literal historical fact, as philosophical allegory, or as something in between has raged for over 2,000 years. Some scholars insist that Plato invented Atlantis entirely, that it was a literary device designed to illustrate philosophical ideas of the nature of wealth and power and imperial ambition. Others argue just that where there is smoke, that a story this specific, this detailed, geographically and culturally rich simply could not have been invented from nothing, behind the legend kernel of genuine history. There is a third group, the researchers and the dedicated who have spent decades in underwater and in dusty archives, believe not just that Atlantis existed, but that they have at least found compelling evidence might be. The search for Atlantis people to some of the most remarkable on Earth. And we are going to follow that search today, beginning with one of the most often overlooked candidates for the location, a remote sitting alone in the middle of the ocean, 900 nearest continental coast, Azores, rising from the surface of the tips of submerged mountains, because that is precisely what they are. Formed by volcanoes over millions of years and sit at the point where three of the Earth's plates meet, of geological forces that the islands themselves shaped by volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. The Portuguese territory, beautiful and remote, a world of green hills dropping into black volcanoes and then into the deep blue of. And for many Atlantis, they run more significant island chain, blue. The Azores, as the list begins with geography, placed Atlantis beyond the seas in the Atlantic Ocean. The Azores are in the ocean, but the arch deeper than sin. Researchers began looking at the underwater geography of the region around the Azores. They found something genuinely remarkable. The islands themselves, those 9 visible peaks rising above the waterline, are merely the high, massive underwater plateau, an elevated section of the mid-Atlantic ridge that in geological terms is extraordinarily close to the surface. If you were to lower the level of the Atlantic Ocean significantly, or if this plateau were to have been elevated above sea level in the distant past and then subsequently submerged, you would have exactly the kind of large landmass that Plato describes. The mid-Atlantic ridge itself is one of the most dramatic geological features on the entire planet. Running for roughly 10,000 miles from north to south through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, it marks the boundary between the tectonic plates that carry the continents of Europe and Africa on one side and the continents of the Americas on the other. The ridge is essentially a continuous mountain range running along the ocean floor, formed by the constant upwelling of magma from deep within the earth. It is the site of enormous geological activity, of volcanic eruptions, of earthquakes, of the slow but relentless movement of the Earth's crustal plates. The Azores sit right at the intersection of 3 of these plates, making them one of the most geologically active places on Earth. Now here is where the Atlantis connection becomes genuinely compelling for those who study it. Plato described Atlantis as sinking beneath the sea in a single catastrophic event. Geological science tells us that dramatic land subsidence events, where large areas of land drop below sea level due to volcanic or tectonic activity, are not only possible but have happened many times throughout Earth's history. The question is whether any such event occurred in the region of the Azores within anything resembling a time frame that would be relevant to the legend. And this is where researchers have found evidence that continues to generate debate. Various studies of the geology of the Azores and the surrounding seafloor have identified evidence of significant past geological events in the region, including periods of volcanic activity and land elevation changes that might have dramatically altered the landscape of the area. Some researchers have pointed to underwater features in the vicinity of the Azores that they argue look remarkably like geological formation merged, plateaus and ridge escarpments that might once level. One of the cited pieces of evidence Atlantis connection involves a sample, a form of basaltic lava only when lava cools rapid in air, as opposed to from the ocean floor near the seem to suggest that at some point, the area from which it was exposed above sea level and had experienced aerial lava flows. If that was the case, it meant there had once been more land in this region than exists today. However, subsequent geological analysis has complicated this picture significantly, and many scientists argue that the interpretation of such samples is far more complex than early Atlantis researchers assumed. But the geological argument is only part of the case. There is also the matter specifically wrote about the Atlantis as an island or sitting in front of what he called the great body of water that he believed all the continent. He specifically said beyond the straits near Achilles, placing proper Atlantis as having been a gateway to other islands, and from those islands one could reach the opposite surrounds the true ocean. Many Atlantis researchers have pointed out read without sounds remarkable describing the Azores as across the Atlantic. The Azores Hypothesis has its critics, and their criticisms are serious. The most fundamental problem is the timeline. Plato explicitly stated that Atlantis sank 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would place the destruction of Atlantis at roughly 11,500 years ago, well within human history, but at the very tail end of the last ice age period when global sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today, and when the geography of the world looked very different. For the Azores to have been a large landmass at that time, we would need evidence of significantly more exposed land in the region than the geological record currently confirms. The rise in sea levels that followed the end of the last ice age was substantial, perhaps as much as 400 feet in some regions, but that is still not enough to explain the complete submersion of a continent-sized island in the area of the Azores. The islands are still there, after all. They did not sink. They remained, which would seem to argue against the idea that this was the site of a dramatic, total submersion event. And yet, and this is the detail that keeps Atlantis researchers coming back to the Azores again and again, Plato did not necessarily describe a continent. He described a large island, and he described that island sinking. What if the Azores represent not the remnants of the sunken island, but the highest peaks of what was once a much larger and more expansive island group, most of which is now beneath the water? It is not an unreasonable question, and it is one that continues to drive exploration and research in the region to this day. The search for Atlantis in the waters around the Azores has involved underwater surveys, sonar mapping of the seafloor, and careful geological analysis. And while no definitive proof of a sunken civilization has yet been found, the researchers who have studied this region most closely argue that the search is far from over. The ocean here is deep, the conditions are often treacherous, and the area to be searched is vast. The Azores, they say, have not given up all their secrets yet. But the Azores are not the only place where people have looked for Atlantis, and they are not even the most surprising. For that, we need to travel in an entirely different direction, not out to sea, but deep into the heart of a continent, specifically deep into the heart of Africa, to one of the most inhospitable and least visited places on the entire surface of the earth. We are going to the Sahara Desert. The Sahara stretches across the northern portion of Africa for nearly 3.5 million square miles, making it the largest hot desert on Earth and one of the most extreme environments our planet offers. Temperatures regularly exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Rainfall in many areas is measured not in inches per year, but in decades between showers. The landscape is overwhelming in its scale and its harshness, a world of sand dunes and gravel plains and bare rock that extends to every horizon and beyond. It is, on the surface, about the last place on Earth you would go looking for a sunken city, and yet, in the western reaches of the Sahara, in the country of Mauritania, there exists a geological formation so strange, so mathematically precise, so eerily reminiscent of the city that Plato described that it has captured the attention of researchers around the world and continues to generate enormous debate. This formation is known by several names. Scientists call it the Richat Structure. Local people have their own names for it. But among those who study the Atlantis mystery, it is clear as the eye of the Sahara, and when you see it from above, you understand immediately why. Satellite imagery and aerial photography, the Richat Structure looks exactly like what you might imagine if Plato's description of the city of Atlantis and pressed it into the surface of the Earth. It is an enormous circular formation, roughly 30 miles across, composed of concentric rings of rock and sediment. Ring within ring within ring, each one separated from the next by a depression, each one displaying different geological characteristics and compositions. From the ground, these rings appear as low ridges rising from the desert floor, walls of rock encircling other walls of rock in a pattern of extraordinary regularity. From the air, the symmetry is breathtaking. It looks artificial. It looks designed. It looks, in the words of more than one researcher, exactly like Plato's Atlantis. And Plato's description of the capital city of Atlantis was indeed of a city built in concentric rings. He wrote of a central island, surrounded by a ring of water, surrounded by a ring of land, surrounded by water, surrounded by another ring of land, with the outermost ring bordered by a vast harbor. He described the rings as being alternating bands of land and water, canal systems of breathtaking engineering, and he gave specific measurements for many of these rings that, when converted from the ancient Greek units he used into modern measurements, produced dimensions that correspond remarkably well to the dimensions of the Richat Structure. The innermost island of Atlantis, Plato said, was about 5 stads in diameter, roughly 3,000 feet. The outer ring of land was 3 stads wide. The ring of water beyond that was 2 stads wide, and so on outward. The Richat Structure in its proportions matches these descriptions in ways that have struck many researchers as too precise to be entirely coincidental. There is also the matter of what surrounded Plato. He described mountains to the north of the city, mountains that protected it from cold northern winds, and a great plain to the south that stretched to the sea. The Richat Structure is located in a region where such topographical features exist in roughly the right proportions and orientations. To the north, there are elevated regions. To the south, the land descends toward what would have been, during a wetter period of African climate history, a much more extensive and navigable waterway system. And this brings us to perhaps the most crucial point in the eye of the Sahara hypothesis. The Sahara has not always been the desert it is today. This is not speculation, but established geological and climatological fact. During a period that scientists call the African Humid Period, also known as the Green Sahara, which lasted roughly from about 11,000 years ago to about 5,000 years ago, the climate of the Sahara was dramatically different from today. The region received substantially more rainfall. Rivers ran through areas that are now bone dry. Lakes existed across the landscape. The vegetation was lush enough to support large animal populations. People lived there. We know this because we have found their bones, their tools, their artwork on cave walls, the remains of the fish they caught and the hippos they hunted. The Sahara was, for a substantial period of human prehistory, a green and living land. If a civilization had existed at the Richat Structure during the period of the Green Sahara, it would have had access to water, to rivers, to a more temperate climate. It might have been situated on or near a body of water that connected it to the sea. And as the climate shifted, as the Sahara dried out, the waterways that surrounded the site would have retreated and eventually disappeared entirely, replaced by the sand and gravel we see today. Now, none of this is to say that the Richat structure is definitively Atlantis. The scientific consensus regarding the Richat structure is that it is a naturally occurring geological formation, created over millions of years by erosion acting on a dome of rock that was uplifted by geological forces. The rings are the result of different rock layers eroding at different rates, exposing concentric bands of different materials. The symmetry, scientists argue, is the symmetry of nature, of geological processes operating consistently over vast timescales. It is remarkable, yes, it is beautiful and strange and awe-inspiring, but it is, in the mainstream scientific view, entirely natural. Atlantis researchers who favor the Richat structure respond to this by pointing out that its natural origin does not preclude its use as the site of a city. If you were an ancient civilization choosing a location to build your capital, a naturally defensible and visually striking circular formation with alternating ridges might be precisely what you would choose. You would not need to carve the rings from nothing. They were already there, provided by geology. All you would need to do is build on them, adapt them, use them as the framework for the city you were creating. But there is a bigger problem with the Richat Structure hypothesis, and it is a problem that its supporters have struggled to adequately address. Plato said Atlantis sank beneath the sea. The Richat structure is in the middle of a desert, hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. There is no evidence that it has ever been submerged. There is no evidence that it was ever above sea level in the relevant sense, and the geological evidence suggests quite the opposite, that this region has been well above sea level for many millions of years. For the Richat structure to be Atlantis, Plato's account of the submersion would have to be either metaphorical, mistaken, or referring to some other kind of catastrophe, perhaps the flooding and drying of a local water body rather than the sinking of an island into the ocean. This is not an insurmountable objection in the eyes of Richat structure advocates. They point out that Plato's account came to him through multiple layers of translation and retelling, from the Egyptian priests who told the story to Solon, from Solon to his descendants, and from there to Plato himself. Errors, embellishments, and misinterpretations could easily have crept into the account at any stage. Perhaps the drowning of Atlantis was not the sinking of an island into the ocean, but the gradual disappearance of a civilization as the rivers and lakes that sustained it dried up. The civilization that had been killed not by water rising but by water retreating. In that reading, Atlantis did not sink. It dried out and the people who lived there dispersed, and the memory of what had been left behind became, over thousands of years of oral tradition, the legend of a land swallowed by the sea. It is a creative interpretation, and whether you find it convincing or not, the Richat structure remains one of the most visually striking and thought-provoking locations associated with the Atlantis legend, a place where the earth itself seems to have conspired to create something that looks, from above, remarkably like the description of a lost civilization. But we must not stay in the desert too long. There are other places to explore, other mysteries to investigate, and some of them are genuinely, provably, scientifically confirmed ancient cities that have sunk beneath the waters. Not theories, not legends, but real places with real buildings and real artifacts now lying on the bottom of real bodies of water. And perhaps the most remarkable of these is a place that most people have never heard of, despite the fact that it is widely considered to be one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Welcome to Pavlopetri. Pavlopetri is an archaeological site located off the southern coast of Greece, in the waters of the Laconian Gulf on the eastern coast of the Peloponnese Peninsula. It is, in the simplest terms, a city that sank. An ancient Greek city, real and physical and made of stone, that now lies scattered across the seabed in shallow water just a few meters below the surface. And it is old, extraordinarily, mind-bendingly old. Pavlopetri dates back approximately 5,000 years, which makes it roughly contemporary with the construction of Stonehenge and the early dynasties of ancient Egypt. It is recognized as one of the oldest known submerged cities in the world, and the complexity and sophistication of its ruins challenges many of our assumptions about the level of urban development achieved by early human societies. The ruins of Pavlopetri were first identified in 1967 by oceanographer Nicholas Fleming, who noticed while conducting surveys of the area that the seabed in the shallows near the coast was not natural. There were shapes under the water that were too regular, too angular, too consistent to be the work of nature. He recognized what he was looking at, the remains of a city. A preliminary survey was conducted in 1968 by a team from Cambridge University, and even those early limited investigations revealed the outlines of streets, buildings, courtyards, and tombs. The site was clearly substantial. But it was not until the 21st century that the full extent and significance of Pavlopetri became apparent. Beginning in 2009, a team of researchers from the University of Nottingham, working in collaboration with the Greek Ephorate of Underwater Antiquities, undertook a comprehensive new survey of the site using the latest underwater surveying technology, including high-resolution sonar mapping and three-dimensional digital reconstruction. What they found exceeded all expectations. Pavlopetri was not just a village or a small settlement. It was a proper city with at least 15 identifiable buildings, multiple streets and lanes, a complex of courtyards and open areas, storage rooms, and what appear to be at least 37 separate chambers within the various structures. The city covers an area of approximately 35,000 square meters, and that may represent only a portion of the original settlement, as the survey identified additional possible structures extending beyond the current survey boundaries. What makes Pavlopetri particularly significant, apart from its extraordinary age, is what its ruins tell us about the sophistication of early Bronze Age society in the Aegean. The people who built this city lived during a period that predates the Mycenaean civilization, which most people think of as the earliest sophisticated Greek culture. Pavlopetri was already ancient when the Mycenaeans rose to prominence, yet the organization of the city, the complexity of its architecture, the sophistication of its layout, all suggest a society far more advanced and organized than the archaeological consensus of a generation ago would have predicted for this period. The city appears to have been inhabited for an extraordinarily long time, with evidence of occupation spanning from roughly 3500 BCE all the way through to approximately 1100 BCE, a period of around 2,400 years. During that time, the city was repeatedly rebuilt and expanded, with different architectural phases layered on top of each other like the pages of a long and complicated history. And then at some point around 1000 BCE, the sea claimed it. The cause of the submersion is not entirely clear. It may have been a single catastrophic event, an earthquake or a seismic shift that caused the land on which the city sat to drop below sea level, or it may have been a more gradual process of land subsidence combined with rising sea levels in the post-glacial period. Either way, the city sank and the sea covered it, and in a remarkable irony, the very water that destroyed Pavlopetri also preserved it. Because it sits in shallow, relatively calm water close to the coast, and because it was covered by sand and sediment that protected it from the worst of the wave action, Pavlopetri has survived in a state of preservation that would have been impossible for an abandoned surface site. The walls are low, worn by millennia of water movement, but they are there. The street plan is legible. The courtyards can be walked in the mind's eye. The storage jars or pitha that once held grain and oil have left their traces in the sediment. Pottery fragments, stone tools, and other artifacts lie exactly where the inhabitants of the city last left them, on the floors and in the corners of rooms that have not seen the open air for 3,000 years. The discovery of Pavlopetri raises a question that haunts many archaeologists. How many other cities like it are out there? How many Bronze Age settlements, how many ancient villages and trading ports and fishing communities now lie beneath the waters of the Mediterranean, the Aegean, the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf? Sea levels have risen significantly since the end of the last ice age, and the coastlines of the ancient world would have looked very different from the coastlines of today. Settlements that were once safely inland or on elevated ground above a harbor are now underwater, their ruins undetected, unmapped, unexcavated. Pavlopetri is not an anomaly. It is a window into a vast underwater archaeological landscape that we are only just beginning to explore, and this raises another question, one that connects directly back to Atlantis. If cities like Pavlopetri can sink beneath the sea and survive for 5,000 years, preserved in the mud and sand of the seabed, then is it so impossible that a larger civilization, one that existed perhaps 10 or 11,000 years ago, might also have been swallowed by rising seas? The end of the last ice age, which occurred roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, was a period of dramatic sea level rise. Geologists estimate that global sea levels rose by something in the range of 300 to 400 feet during this period, a rise that would have inundated enormous areas of coastal land around the world. Every coastline on Earth would have been affected. Every coastal community, every settlement built near the water during the height of the Ice Age would have been slowly, or in some cases not so slowly, overwhelmed by the rising sea. Could the legend of Atlantis be a memory of this great inundation? Could the story of a city sinking beneath the sea in a day and a night be a mythologized, dramatized recollection of the catastrophic flooding of a real coastal civilization during the great sea level rise that ended the Ice Age? It is a theory that some serious researchers have advanced, and while it remains speculative, it is the kind of speculation that is grounded in real geological and archaeological evidence. The sea has swallowed real cities before. We know this now because we have found them. And if one ancient city could be swallowed by the sea, there is no reason, in principle, why another could not. The waters of the Mediterranean and the Aegean are remarkable for the number and quality of their archaeological remains, both above and below the waterline. But the search for ancient underwater cities is by no means confined to this part of the world. Far across the Atlantic Ocean, in the warm, transparent waters of the Caribbean Sea, another extraordinary discovery has been made, one that is far more controversial than Pavlopetri, far less well understood, and far more suggestive of something that could, if confirmed, change our understanding of ancient history in the most profound and fundamental ways imaginable. In the year 2001, a team of ocean researchers working for a Canadian company called Advanced Digital Communications was conducting a sonar survey of the seafloor off the western coast of Cuba, near the tip of the Guanahacoibes Peninsula. The survey was being conducted as part of a larger project exploring the seafloor of the Cuban exclusive economic zone, looking primarily for shipwrecks and other features of maritime historical interest. What the sonar revealed was not what anyone expected. At a depth of approximately 2,000 feet below the surface, the sonar images showed an area of the seabed that appeared to be covered in large, geometrically regular stone structures. Not random rock formations, not the kind of natural geological features that sonar typically picks up, but shapes that looked, to the researchers who first analyzed the images, unmistakably like the ruins of buildings. Pyramids, or at least pyramid-like structures, flat-topped platforms, regular perpendicular lines that suggested streets or walls. The site covered an area of roughly 8 square kilometers, and the structures within it were of a scale that suggested not a small settlement but a major architectural complex. The lead researcher, Paulina Zelitsky, was sufficiently convinced by what the sonar had shown that the team returned to the site with a remotely operated vehicle equipped with cameras, hoping to get visual confirmation of what the sonar data suggested. The images sent back by the ROV were remarkable. They showed large blocks of stone on the seabed, some of them extremely large blocks that appeared to be roughly cut, roughly shaped, some of them in positions that suggested deliberate arrangement. The team reported seeing what appeared to be smooth granite surfaces, geometric shapes and structures that were consistent with the architectural remains of a large ancient city. The discovery was announced to the world, and was immediately one of the most sensational archaeological stories of the early 21st century. The media coverage was extensive and enthusiastic. Was this Atlantis? Had the ruins of a great ancient civilization been found at the bottom of the sea off the coast of Cuba? The excitement was palpable and understandable. If genuine, this would be the most significant archaeological discovery in the history of the world. But the scientific community responded with significant caution, and for good reasons. The site was extraordinarily deep. 2,000 feet is well below the range of conventional diving and requires specialized equipment even for remotely operated vehicles. Only a limited amount of visual data was collected. The sonar images, while striking, were open to interpretation. Natural geological formations can sometimes mimic the appearance of artificial structures, particularly on sonar, where the resolution and the interpretation of the data can be tricky. And perhaps most importantly, the depth of the site presents a serious geological problem for any ancient civilization hypothesis. For these structures to have been built by human beings, they would have needed to be above sea level at the time of their construction. 2,000 feet is a very long way below the current surface of the ocean. Even at the height of the last ice age, when sea levels were at their lowest, the ocean's surface was only about 400 feet lower than it is today. That means that for these structures to have been above sea level, the land on which they sit would have needed to have been elevated by approximately 1,600 feet above its current position. That is a geological uplift on a massive scale, and for it to have occurred within any kind of human time frame, the geological processes involved would have had to have been extraordinarily rapid and dramatic, far beyond anything that current geological science considers plausible for this region. Unless, of course, the timeline were pushed back far further than any human habitation of the Americas is currently believed to have occurred. 12,000 years ago, the area off the coast of Cuba was still well below sea level, even accounting for lower ice age sea levels. For the structures to have been built in an era of human civilization and then submerged to their current depth, we would need to either radically revise our understanding of prehistoric sea levels or propose some other geological mechanism for the subsidence of this section of seafloor. Neither option is currently supported by the mainstream scientific evidence. Many geologists who reviewed the available data from the Cuban site argued that what the sonar and the ROV cameras had captured was most likely a natural geological formation. The Caribbean region is geologically complex, with significant volcanism and tectonic activity. There are natural formations in this area that can produce regular, angular block-like shapes in rock, particularly in certain types of volcanic and sedimentary geology. The geometric regularity that Zelitsky's team interpreted as evidence of artificial construction could, in the view of most mainstream scientists, be adequately explained by natural geological processes. The investigation of the site has been complicated by a number of factors, including the depth of the water, the practical difficulties of working in Cuban territorial waters, and the limited funding available for such research. As of the available information, no comprehensive archaeological survey of the site has been completed. No artifacts that would definitively confirm human activity have been recovered from the site, and the question of whether the Cuban underwater structures are natural or artificial remains unresolved. What makes the Cuban site so compelling to those who believe in it, despite all the scientific objections, is the visual impact of the images. There is something about the regularity of those blocks, the flatness of those surfaces, the right angles and the parallel lines, that speaks to the human pattern recognition instinct in a very powerful way. We are extraordinarily good at seeing patterns, particularly the patterns of human construction, because we have lived in built environments our entire lives and our brains are wired to recognize the signatures of deliberate human activity. When we see something that looks like a building, it is very hard to believe it is not a building, and those images from the seabed off Cuba look, to many eyes, very much like buildings. The Cuban site remains one of the most intriguing and unresolved underwater mysteries in the world. It may be nothing more than an unusual geological formation. It may be something else entirely. Until a properly equipped archaeological survey can be conducted at the site, with the full resources of modern underwater archaeology brought to bear on the question, we simply cannot say with certainty what lies on that section of the Caribbean seafloor. And that uncertainty, that unresolved tension between the possible and the impossible, is part of what makes the search for lost civilizations so endlessly fascinating. But let us step back from the specific question of Atlantis for a moment and consider the broader landscape of underwater archaeology, because there is an enormous amount happening in this field that has nothing to do with legendary lost civilizations and everything to do with real, documented, confirmed history that has been hidden beneath the water for centuries or millennia. The oceans and seas of the world are, in a very real sense, the greatest natural archive in existence. Unlike surface sites, which are exposed to weather, erosion, human encroachment, and the ravages of time, underwater sites are protected by their very inaccessibility. The cold, dark, low-oxygen environment of the deep ocean is, in many circumstances, extraordinarily good at preserving organic materials that would have rotted away long ago on the surface. Wood, leather, rope, cloth, even food have been found in a state of remarkable preservation at underwater sites, offering a window into the past that no surface site can match. And when you add to this the extraordinary number of ships that have sunk in the world's waters over the course of human history, carrying with them the goods, the cargo, the personal belongings, and sometimes the literal treasures of the civilizations that built them, you begin to understand why underwater archaeology has become one of the most exciting and rapidly developing fields in all of historical research. The technology available to underwater archaeologists today is transformative. Side-scan sonar can map large areas of the seabed with extraordinary resolution, revealing features that would be invisible to the naked eye. Multi-beam sonar systems can create three-dimensional maps of the seafloor in stunning detail. Remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, equipped with high-definition cameras and articulated robotic arms, can survey sites at depths that no human diver could safely reach and collect samples with extraordinary precision. Autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, can be programmed to conduct systematic surveys of large areas without direct human control, covering ground far more efficiently than any human team could. And advances in the analysis of DNA, chemical isotopes, and other trace materials mean that even fragmentary organic remains can now yield information about the people who left them that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations of researchers. All of this technology is being brought to bear not just on the search for Atlantis or other legendary lost civilizations, but on the systematic exploration and documentation of the real, confirmed underwater archaeological record. And that record, as it is gradually being revealed, is turning out to be vastly richer and more extraordinary than anyone previously imagined. Consider, for example, the case of the Antikythera mechanism. In 1900, a group of sponge divers were blown off course by a storm and sheltered near the uninhabited Greek island of Antikythera. While diving the next day, they discovered an ancient shipwreck on the seabed, and what they found in the wreck would eventually prove to be one of the most remarkable objects from the ancient world ever recovered. Among the artifacts they brought to the surface was what appeared to be a corroded lump of bronze and wood, about the size of a shoebox. It sat in a museum for decades before researchers realized that it was, in fact, an extraordinarily sophisticated mechanical device, a hand-cranked mechanical computer capable of predicting astronomical positions and eclipses, tracking the movements of the sun and the moon and the 5 planets then known to the ancient world, and calculating dates in multiple ancient calendar systems. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be known, was built sometime around 100 to 150 BCE, making it roughly 2,000 years old. And it was so far ahead of anything else from that period in terms of mechanical complexity and precision that its discovery fundamentally changed our understanding of what ancient Greek technology was capable of. Nothing remotely comparable to it appears in the historical record for another 1,500 years. The point is this: the Antikythera mechanism was discovered by accident, by sponge divers taking shelter from a storm. It sat in a museum without being properly understood for decades. It required modern imaging technology to fully reveal its internal structure, and even today, researchers are still working to understand all of its functions and capabilities. If a shipwreck casually discovered in shallow water could contain something that extraordinary, what might be waiting in the deeper, less explored parts of the ocean floor? The mind reels at the possibilities. From Greece, we travel now to the warm, clear waters of the Mediterranean coast of Turkey, where one of the most productive underwater archaeological environments in the world has been revealing its secrets for decades. The coastline of what is now Turkey was, in antiquity, the western edge of a complex of ancient civilizations that includes some of the most famous names in history: the Trojans, the Lydians, the Hittites, the Persians, and the Greeks who colonized the entire coast from the Black Sea to the Nile Delta. This was one of the busiest maritime regions in the ancient world, a place where ships from dozens of different civilizations crossed paths, traded, competed, and occasionally sank. Underwater archaeologist George Bass, often called the father of underwater archaeology, began excavating shipwrecks off the Turkish coast in the 1960s, and what his team found transformed the field. They excavated the Cape Geladanya wreck, a Bronze Age merchant ship dating to around 1200 BCE, and the Uluburun wreck, found in 1982 off the cape of the same name, which turned out to be one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The Uluburun wreck dated to around 1300 BCE, and its cargo was a snapshot of the entire Mediterranean world of the Late Bronze Age, a world of interconnected civilizations trading with each other across vast distances on a scale that scholars had not previously fully appreciated. The cargo of the Uluburun ship included copper ingots from Cyprus, tin ingots from sources in the Near East, ebony logs from Africa, ivory from both elephants and hippopotamuses, raw glass in the form of ingots, pottery from Cyprus and Canaan and Egypt and the Aegean, a gold scarab bearing the name of the Egyptian Queen Nefertiti, weapons, jewelry, tools, foodstuffs, and a host of other objects. This was a ship that was trading across the full width and breadth of the Mediterranean world. The sheer variety and quantity of the cargo told a story of Bronze Age commerce that was far more sophisticated, far more interconnected, and far more globally minded than the conventional picture of ancient trade had suggested. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was not a world of isolated civilizations occasionally making contact with each other. It was a world of regular, systematic, large-scale international trade, of diplomatic relationships and commercial networks that spanned thousands of miles. And all of this we know because a ship sank off the coast of Turkey around 1300 BCE and lay undisturbed on the seabed for 3,000 years until a sponge diver found it. The underwater environment preserved what would have completely disappeared on the surface. The cargo speaks to us across 3 millennia with a directness and a completeness that no textual record can match. Now, let us talk about what happens when you go deeper. Much, much deeper, because the shallow coastal waters where Pavlopetri and the Uluburun wreck were found are, by the standards of the ocean, practically dry land. The true deep ocean, the abyssal plains and ocean trenches that make up the majority of the world's seafloor, exists in a realm of conditions so extreme that it was, for most of human history, as inaccessible as the surface of another planet. The pressure at the bottom of the ocean is extraordinary, crushing, life-destroying by every standard we apply to surface existence. The temperature is just above freezing. The darkness is absolute and total. No sunlight reaches these depths. No photosynthesis occurs, and yet life is there. The discovery that the deep ocean was not the barren, lifeless desert that earlier scientists assumed has been one of the great revelations of modern oceanography. when the first deep-sea dredges came back from the abyss in the 19th century, trailing their hauls of bizarre creatures that no one had ever seen before, they shattered the prevailing theory of a dead zone below a certain depth. And when the first deep-sea submersibles began carrying human observers into the depths in the 20th century, what those observers found was so startling, so completely outside anything previously imagined, that it required a fundamental rethinking of the basic principles of biology. But perhaps the single most dramatic and scientifically significant discovery in the history of deep ocean exploration occurred in 1977, when a team of scientists descended in the research submersible Alvin to the East Pacific Rise, a section of the mid-ocean ridge system located in the Pacific Ocean. They were looking for evidence of hydrothermal activity, for hot water venting from the seafloor, which had been predicted on theoretical grounds. They found it. But what they found along with it was something that no theory had predicted. Clustered around the hydrothermal vents, in water superheated to temperatures of several hundred degrees Celsius, in the complete absence of sunlight, in the crushing pressure of the deep ocean, was life. An extraordinary, abundant, diverse, and entirely self-sufficient ecosystem that had no relationship whatsoever to the sun-powered food chain that underpins all life as we previously understood it. Tube worms, some of them over 2 meters in length, their blood red with hemoglobin that binds not oxygen but hydrogen sulfide, clams the size of dinner plates, shrimp with no eyes but with heat-sensing organs on their backs to navigate the scalding thermal gradient around the vents. Mats of bacteria that form the base of an entire food web, deriving their energy not from sunlight but from the chemical process of chemosynthesis, using the hydrogen sulfide and other chemicals pouring from the vents to produce the organic molecules that feed everything above them in the ecosystem. This discovery was nothing less than a revolution in biology. It proved that life did not require sunlight. It proved that ecosystems could be entirely self-contained, powered by the internal heat of the earth rather than the external heat of the sun. It demonstrated that the basic requirements for life that we had assumed, liquid water, a source of energy, the right chemical building blocks, could be met in the deep ocean just as well as on the sun-lit surface. And it opened up an entirely new set of questions about where else in the universe life might be found, because if life can thrive without sunlight in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean, then perhaps it can also thrive in the hidden oceans beneath the frozen surfaces of moons like Europa and Enceladus. But the hydrothermal vents are more than just a biological curiosity. They are a window into the deep processes of the Earth itself, into the geological mechanisms that shape our planet and have shaped it for billions of years. The vents are located along the boundaries of tectonic plates, where the plates separate and the Earth's hot interior is exposed to the cold water of the deep ocean. The water that jets from the vents has percolated down through cracks in the seafloor, been heated by the hot rock far below, dissolved minerals from the rock as it traveled, and then been expelled back into the ocean at temperatures that can exceed 400 degrees Celsius. Remarkably, the water does not boil at these temperatures, because the pressure at the bottom of the ocean is so extreme that it raises the boiling point of water far above its surface level value. As the superheated, mineral-laden water from the vents hits the cold ocean water, the dissolved minerals precipitate out and form chimneys of mineral deposits that can grow to extraordinary heights. These structures, called black smokers when the minerals precipitating are dark-colored sulfides, can reach heights of 15 to 20 meters. They are in miniature the tallest and most dramatic geological formations on the ocean floor, and they are in a constant state of growth and destruction, building up as minerals are deposited, and then collapsing under their own weight or being destroyed by changes in the vent activity beneath them. The tube worms that live at the hydrothermal vents deserve special mention because they are, even by the extraordinary standards of deep-sea biology, genuinely remarkable creatures. Rifshapachyptilla, the giant tube worm of the Pacific vents, is perhaps the fastest growing marine invertebrate known to science. It can grow from a newly settled larva to a mature worm more than a meter in length in under 2 years. It has no mouth. It has no digestive system. It feeds entirely through a specialized organ called a trophosome, which is packed with bacteria that perform chemosynthesis, converting the chemicals from the vent water into food for the worm. The worm provides the bacteria with a protected environment and access to the raw chemicals from the vent water. The bacteria provide the worm with the nutrients it needs to survive and grow. It is a partnership of extraordinary intimacy and specificity, one that evolved in complete isolation from the surface world, and that represents an entirely distinct path in the evolution of life on Earth. From the extraordinary biology of the deep ocean, let us travel now to one of the most mysterious acoustic phenomena ever recorded in the deep sea, a sound so strange, so powerful, and so completely inexplicable that it has never been fully explained despite decades of investigation. A sound that was, for a time, one of the most talked about mysteries in all of oceanography. A sound so bizarre that the scientists who detected it gave it a name that perfectly captures its enigmatic character. They called it the bloop. In the summer of 1997, scientists at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration were monitoring a network of underwater hydrophones, sensitive acoustic sensors suspended in the ocean at a depth where sound waves travel with extraordinary efficiency, a layer of the ocean known as the SOFAR channel. These hydrophones were originally deployed during the Cold War to track the movements of Soviet submarines, using the fact that sound waves traveling in the SOFAR channel can propagate for thousands of miles without significant attenuation. After the Cold War ended, the system was repurposed for scientific research, monitoring ocean sounds including whale calls, submarine volcanism, and the background noise of shipping traffic. It was a remarkable scientific instrument for listening to the voice of the ocean. On July 19, 1997, the hydrophone network picked up a sound, not just any sound, a sound of extraordinary amplitude and distinctive characteristics that had never been recorded before. The sound was powerful enough to be detected simultaneously by hydrophone arrays thousands of miles apart. When the scientists analyzed its acoustic signature, its frequency profile, they found that it increased rapidly in frequency over the roughly 1-minute duration of the recording, rising from a very low, deep rumble to a higher pitch in a way that was unusual, but that had some faint similarities to the calls of very large biological organisms. The sound was detected on multiple sensors with enough separation to roughly triangulate its source to a location somewhere in the southern Pacific Ocean, in a remote and largely unexplored area of the deep sea. The scientists were baffled. The amplitude of the bloop was so great that if it had been made by a biological organism, that organism would have to have been far larger than any known animal. The blue whale is the largest animal on Earth, and its calls are extraordinarily powerful and can travel for hundreds of miles through the SOFAR channel. But the bloop was orders of magnitude louder. If it was a whale, it would have to have been an animal many times larger than any blue whale ever measured. The notion of a creature that large existing in the ocean without ever having been detected or observed seemed, to put it mildly, implausible. The mystery of the bloop attracted enormous public interest and generated considerable speculation. Was it a giant squid? Was it some unknown species of massive ocean creature? Various imaginative theories were proposed, some more serious than others. But the most rigorous analysis of the acoustic data, conducted by scientists at NOAA and other institutions, eventually pointed to a more prosaic, but in many ways equally fascinating explanation. The sound, when carefully analyzed, had characteristics consistent with the signature of ice quakes, the sounds produced when large masses of ice break off from ice shelves or icebergs and fracture under stress. The rough triangulation of the bloop's source placed it in the vicinity of the Antarctic ice shelves, where enormous masses of ice are in constant dynamic motion, cracking and calving and breaking apart in response to temperature changes and ocean movement. Subsequent analysis of similar sounds recorded in the same area supported this conclusion. The Sofar Channel conducts sounds from ice movements in the Southern Ocean with extraordinary efficiency, which explained why the sound could be so powerful and could be detected at such great distances. The rapidly rising frequency of the bloop was consistent with the complex acoustics of a large ice fracture event. The mystery of the bloop, at least in the mainstream scientific view, was solved. But not everyone was entirely satisfied with this explanation. The bloop retained its hold on the public imagination, and understandably so. There is something deeply resonant about the idea of an unknown giant in the deep ocean, some creature so vast that its voice shakes the water for thousands of miles. The ocean is large enough and deep enough and poorly enough explored that the idea cannot be entirely dismissed on its face. We have found new species of large marine animals in the recent past. The megamouth shark was unknown to science until 1976, when one became accidentally entangled in a naval anchor. The giant squid Architeuthis was known only from fragments and corpses for most of scientific history, not photographed alive in its natural habitat until 2004. The colossal squid, even larger than the giant squid, was not fully appreciated as a distinct species until the 1990s. The ocean keeps its secrets well. We have been exploring the deep and the mysterious, but let us come up now toward the surface, not entirely, but toward the shallower waters where human history has left its most dramatic and tangible marks. Let us talk about shipwrecks. And not just any shipwreck, but the most famous shipwreck in all of history, the wreck that has captivated the world for over a century, the wreck whose story has been told and retold in books and films and exhibitions beyond counting, and whose physical remains on the ocean floor have become one of the most intensively studied and most vividly documented archaeological sites in the world. We are talking, of course, about the Titanic. The RMS Titanic was, at the time of its construction, the largest and most luxurious ocean liner ever built. Constructed by the Belfast shipbuilding firm of Harland and Wolff for the White Star Line, it measured almost 270 meters in length and displaced over 52,000 tons. It was a floating city, with accommodations ranging from the sumptuous first-class staterooms and grand salons that rivaled the finest hotels in the world, through the comfortable if more modest second-class cabins, to the crowded but functional third-class dormitories, where hundreds of emigrants were making the journey to new lives in a new world. The ship was equipped with the latest technology, including a powerful wireless telegraph system, the most advanced navigation systems of the era, and 16 lifeboats, though as events would prove tragically, nowhere near enough lifeboats for the number of people on board. The Titanic left Southampton on April 10, 1912, on its maiden voyage to New York. On board were some 2,224 passengers and crew, representing the full spectrum of Edwardian society. Among the passengers were some of the wealthiest and most prominent people in the world, traveling in the heights of first-class luxury. There were also hundreds of emigrants from Ireland and Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, traveling in third class with all their earthly possessions packed into trunks and cases, carrying with them the hopes and dreams of a new life on a new continent. 4 days into the voyage, in the early hours of April 15, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank. The iceberg had been spotted by the lookouts in the crow's nest, but not in time to avoid the collision entirely. The ship's steel hull scraped along the underwater spur of the iceberg, and the impact opened a series of breaches in the hull plating below the waterline. The ocean poured in. The flooding was rapid and relentless. Within 2 hours and 40 minutes of the collision, the Titanic had broken in two and both sections had plunged to the bottom of the North Atlantic, settling on the seafloor at a depth of approximately 3,800 meters, roughly 2.5 miles below the surface. More than 1,500 people died. Of the 2,224 aboard, only 710 survived, saved by the lifeboats and rescued by the Cunard liner Carpathia, which arrived at the scene approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes after the Titanic disappeared beneath the water. The death toll was so staggering, and the human stories surrounding the disaster so powerful, that the sinking of the Titanic became one of the defining events of the 20th century, a tragedy that resonated far beyond the lives of those directly involved and came to symbolize in the cultural imagination the hubris of human technological achievement and the indifference of nature to that achievement. For over 7 decades, the wreck of the Titanic lay undiscovered on the ocean floor, 2.5 miles below the surface of the North Atlantic, in water so cold and so dark that the idea of reaching it seemed, to most people, purely theoretical. Various expeditions were proposed over the years, and various searches were conducted, but the ocean floor is vast and the technology of deep-sea exploration was, for most of the 20th century, inadequate to the task of finding a specific ship in such deep water. The Titanic's precise location was not accurately known. The distress signals sent by the ship had given approximate coordinates, but in the confusion of the sinking and the subsequent rescue operations, the exact position had never been definitively established. It was not until the summer of 1985 that the wreck was finally found. A joint American-French expedition led by the American oceanographer Robert Ballard, using a combination of surface sonar and a deep-towed camera system called Argo, located the wreck on September 1, 1985. The discovery was a global sensation. The photographs that Ballard's team brought back, images of the Titanic's boilers lying on the muddy floor of the North Atlantic, its bow embedded in the sediment, its steel hull draped with the rust formations that deep-sea researchers call rusticles, were at once heartbreaking and majestic. Here was the physical remains of one of the most famous disasters in history, preserved in the cold darkness of the deep ocean, speaking across the decades with a directness that no photograph from the surface world could match. Subsequent expeditions to the Titanic wreck, many using the same submersible Alvin that had discovered the hydrothermal vents, have documented the wreck in extraordinary detail. The bow section, which struck the ocean floor with enormous force and buried its nose several meters into the sediment, is the most recognizable and most photographed part of the wreck. The grand staircase, once one of the most celebrated features of the ship's interior, is gone, the wood having long since been consumed by wood-boring organisms, but its outline can still be discerned in the structure of the hull. The crow's nest from which the iceberg was spotted is still attached to the forward mast. Stationary objects, things that could not float away, things made of non-biodegradable materials like glass and ceramic and metal, lie scattered across the debris field that stretches for miles around the main wreck sections. Wine bottles still sealed, their contents presumably still intact. Passengers' shoes, the leather long since gone but the shape still preserved in the sediment where they fell. A leather wallet, its owner's identity lost but its presence on the ocean floor a poignant reminder of the personal, individual scale of the tragedy. The Titanic is also, unfortunately, deteriorating rapidly. The rusticles that cover much of the hull are the fruiting bodies of bacterial colonies that are slowly consuming the iron of the ship's structure. The hull itself has been weakened by the impact of the sinking and by decades of the ocean's chemical action. Sections of the ship that were intact and recognizable in the early expeditions of the 1980s have since collapsed. Researchers who have made multiple visits to the wreck over the years report dramatic changes between visits. It is estimated that within another 100 years, the Titanic will have essentially ceased to exist as a recognizable structure, dissolved back into the chemistry of the deep ocean. The great ship will be gone, not swallowed in the catastrophic hours of April 15, 1912, but consumed gradually, one molecule at a time, by the relentless biology of the deep sea. This slow disappearance makes the documentation of the Titanic wreck not just a matter of historical interest, but a matter of some urgency. Every expedition that visits the site and records what is there preserves, in some sense, a record of what was lost. And every image, every measurement, every sample brought back from the ocean floor adds to our understanding not just of the ship and the disaster, but of the broader question of how objects behave and change and eventually disappear in the deep ocean environment. The Titanic is simultaneously a cemetery, a museum, and a laboratory, and it is one of the most complex and sensitive underwater sites in the world. But the Titanic, famous as it is far from the only remarkable shipwreck that the ocean has claimed and preserved. The history of human navigation is the history of ships being lost, and ships have been lost in every ocean and every sea in every era of human seafaring. From ancient Greek merchant vessels to Viking longships, from Chinese junks to Portuguese caravels, from Spanish galleons to modern tankers, the ocean floor is carpeted with the remains of human enterprise and human tragedy. And while most of these wrecks have been lost to history entirely, some of them carry enough treasure, enough historical significance, or enough mystery that they have become the subjects of intense and sometimes obsessive searches. One of the most important of these searches, a search that combined the obsessive dedication of a treasure hunter with the scientific rigor of an archaeologist and the sheer, stubborn persistence of a force of nature, led to the discovery of what may be the single most valuable sunken treasure ever recovered. And the story of that discovery is one of the most remarkable in the entire history of ocean exploration, a story that spans decades, crosses continents and oceans, involves courtrooms and federal law and the determination of a single extraordinary man who refused, absolutely refused, to stop looking even when every rational calculation suggested he should. The treasure is Spanish. And to understand why it was on the ocean floor at all, we need to go back almost 4 centuries, to a world of wooden ships and golden dreams and the most brutal and effective system of wealth extraction ever devised in human history. Spain in the early 17th century was the most powerful nation in the world, and it was powerful largely because of the wealth it was extracting from its colonies in the Americas. For a century and more, Spanish expeditions had been scouring the New World for gold, silver, and gems, stripping the wealth of the Aztec and Inca empires, working indigenous and enslaved African people to death in mines that produced staggering quantities of precious metals. This wealth was transported back to Spain in fleets of large wooden sailing ships called galleons, organized into convoys that crossed the Atlantic Ocean twice a year in carefully coordinated movements designed to minimize the risk of attack by pirates and rival naval powers. The system was called the flota, the fleet, and it was one of the most sophisticated logistical operations of the early modern era. Ships from various ports in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico would gather at Havana, Cuba, then sail in convoy northward through the Florida Straits, a narrow passage between the tip of Florida and the Bahama Banks, before turning east across the Atlantic. The Florida Straits were the bottleneck of the entire system, and they were also one of the most dangerous stretches of water on the Atlantic rim. The straits are subject to powerful currents, sudden violent storms, and treacherous shallow reefs, and over the centuries of the flota system, they claimed many ships and enormous quantities of treasure. In 1622, a fleet of 28 ships set sail from Havana, loaded with the accumulated wealth of the Spanish colonies. The fleet was already running late in the season, and experienced sailors warned that the weather was becoming dangerous. The warnings were ignored, or at least overruled by the pressure to deliver the treasure to Spain. 2 days after leaving Havana, the fleet was struck by a hurricane. In the chaos and violence of the storm, 8 ships were lost, wrecked on the reefs and shallows of the Florida Keys and the dry Tortugas. Among the lost ships were some of the wealthiest vessels in the fleet, including the Nuestra Señora de Atocha, which was carrying one of the largest single cargoes of treasure ever assembled in the history of the Spanish flota system. The Atocha carried silver, enormous quantities of silver, not silver coins or silver jewelry, but silver ingots and silver discs, the product of the mines of Peru and Bolivia, raw refined silver in quantities that stagger the imagination. She also carried gold in the form of ingots, chains, and coins. She carried copper. She carried tobacco and indigo. And she carried emeralds, extraordinary emeralds from the mines of Colombia, some of them of a quality and size that would be remarkable by any standard in any era. The total value of the cargo she carried has been estimated at many hundreds of millions of dollars in modern values. When the Atocha hit the reef and sank, the Spanish made immediate and strenuous efforts to recover the treasure. They knew approximately where the ship had gone down, and they sent divers to the site within days of the wreck. But the hurricane had scattered the wreck across a wide area, much of the cargo was buried under sand, and the diving technology of the 17th century was primitive beyond description. Divers could hold their breath for perhaps 2 or 3 minutes at a time and could reach depths of only 30 or 40 feet. The Atocha had sunk in somewhat deeper water. They recovered some material, but the main cargo of silver eluded them entirely. And then a second hurricane struck, and the wreck was scattered even further, and the position of the main cargo became completely lost. For 3.5 centuries, the Atocha lay on the ocean floor, its treasure slowly being buried deeper and deeper under the shifting sands of the seabed. Occasional efforts were made to find it over the decades and centuries, but none succeeded. The treasure became legendary, a ghost story told among treasure hunters and maritime historians, an almost mythical prize that no one would ever really find. And then came Mel Fisher. Mel Fisher was a chicken farmer from Indiana who had become fascinated with treasure hunting and diving in the 1950s and 1960s. He was not a trained archaeologist or historian or oceanographer. He was a man of extraordinary enthusiasm, of infectious optimism, of a determination so absolute that it could fairly be described as genetic, something he passed on to his children, who would become his closest partners in the search. He was also a supremely skilled and knowledgeable diver and salvager, and he had a track record of finding things that other people had given up on finding. Fisher and his company, Treasure Salvers, began the search for the Atocha in the late 1960s, working from their base in Florida. They had studied the historical documents, the Spanish archives in Seville, the salvage reports from 1622, the navigational records and the storm accounts, and they had developed a theory about where the wreck lay. The search area was vast, thousands of square miles of the shallow waters of the Florida Keys and the deeper water beyond them. The work was back-breaking, expensive, and seemingly endless. Year after year, Fisher and his team crisscrossed the search area with magnetometers and other detection equipment, pulling up anchor chains and cannonballs and the debris of centuries of maritime history, but not finding the main treasure. There were victories along the way. They found scattered artifacts from the Atocha, confirming that they were in the right general area. They found one of the other ships from the 1622 fleet, the Santa Margarita, in 1980 and recovered substantial treasure from it. But the Atocha herself, the mother lode, the silver that had eluded the Spanish salvagers 3.5 centuries earlier, remained hidden. The search cost Fisher everything. It cost money year after year as investors grew discouraged and funds ran short. It cost him the lives of his son Dirk and his daughter-in-law Angel, who drowned when their search boat sank during the operation. It cost him his reputation, as critics accused him of reckless management and financial irregularities. It cost him years of legal battles with the state of Florida and later with the federal government, both of whom claimed jurisdiction over whatever treasure he might find. But Fisher refused to stop. His rallying cry, repeated to his crew every morning for 16 years, became legendary among treasure hunters and explorers everywhere. Every day he would say, "Is today's the day. Today's the day we find the treasure." On July 20, 1985, after 16 years of searching, today was finally the day. Fisher's salvage vessel was working a section of the search area off the Marquesas Keys, about 35 miles west of Key West, when the magnetometer registered an anomaly. Divers went down to investigate. What they found was a solid mass of silver bars on the ocean floor, stacked like cordwood, thousands of them, a glittering mountain of wealth that had been sitting on the seabed for 363 years. The main cargo hold of the Nuestra Señora de Atocha had been found. The recovery operation took years and yielded treasures beyond anything that had been imagined even by those who believed in the size of the Atocha's cargo. Over 40 tons of silver bars. 114 gold bars, 500 gold coins, 250,000 silver coins, hundreds of emeralds, many of them of extraordinary quality, some of them of sizes that are genuinely rare in the gemological world, jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship, weapons, tools, personal items of the sailors and passengers who died when the ship went down. The total value of the recovered treasure has been estimated at well over $1.1 billion, and that figure may be conservative. Fisher's story, the story of his search and his triumph, is one of the great human interest narratives of the 20th century, but it is also something more than a treasure-hunting adventure story. The Atocha recovery generated an enormous amount of historical and archaeological information about the Spanish colonial trade system, about the technology and craft traditions of the early 17th century, about the individuals who made the voyage and their lives and their possessions. The emeralds alone have provided gemologists and historians with unprecedented information about the Colombian emerald trade of the colonial period. The silver bars, each stamped with the marks of the mine from which the silver came, the smelting house that refined it, and the asker who certified its quality, provide a direct link to the colonial mining economy of South America. Every object recovered from the Atocha is both a piece of treasure and a piece of history. Before we close the first part of our journey into the depths, let us pause and consider some of the natural wonders that the ocean and the earth have produced, wonders that are not ancient cities or sunken ships, but that are no less extraordinary for that. The natural world, particularly the natural world at the extremes of temperature and pressure that characterize the deep ocean and certain other geological environments, is capable of producing phenomena of breathtaking beauty and complexity that can seem, to human eyes, almost supernatural. Consider, for example, the frozen waves of Antarctica. In certain conditions, along the ice coast of the Antarctic continent, the ocean forms waves in the traditional way, driven by wind and current. But sometimes, before those waves can fully break and dissipate, the temperature drops sharply enough that the water in the wave flash freezes, capturing the wave in mid-motion, preserving its curling shape, its arc, its sense of suspended movement in a medium of ice. What results is a sculpture of extraordinary beauty, a wave frozen in time, preserved in crystal clarity, showing the exact form that the ocean's surface took at a single impossible moment. These frozen waves have been photographed extensively, and the images have a quality that makes them seem almost unreal, too perfect, too artistically composed to be the product of random natural forces. And yet they are entirely natural, entirely unplanned, the result of two simple physical processes, wave formation and flash freezing, meeting at the right moment in the right place. The Antarctic environment is, in many ways, one of the most extreme on Earth, and it produces natural phenomena that are found nowhere else. The ice shelves that extend from the continent are among the largest structures in the natural world, some of them larger than individual countries. When sections of these shelves calve off as icebergs, the resulting bergs can be of staggering size, hundreds of miles long, floating islands of ice drifting slowly northward on the Southern Ocean's currents. The largest icebergs ever recorded have been larger than many small nations, their surfaces exposed to the sun and wind, while their underwater portions, typically constituting about 90% of the total volume, extend hundreds of meters below the surface. And it is in the context of these Antarctic ice structures that we return briefly to the acoustic mystery of the Bloop, because the Southern Ocean around Antarctica is not a quiet place. It is full of extraordinary sounds, the cracking and groaning of the ice, the thunderous reports of calving events, the complex haunting calls of the whales that congregate in Antarctic waters to feed during the austral summer. The Sofar Channel carries all of these sounds with extraordinary efficiency, amplifying them and propagating them across the entire ocean basin. The deep ocean is, in a very real sense, a symphony orchestra of geological and biological sound, playing a constant concert that human ears are almost never present to hear. We have also not yet visited one of the most extraordinary rivers in the world, a river that is technically above the ground rather than beneath it, but that deserves mention in any discussion of the world's most remarkable water features. In the mountains of Colombia, in a remote and difficult-to-access national park, there flows a river that for a few months each year becomes arguably the most colorful natural waterway on Earth. The Caño Cristales, sometimes called the River of Five Colors, or the most beautiful river in the world, or the river that ran away from paradise, flows through the Serranía de la Macarena mountain range, and during the brief seasonal window when the conditions are exactly right, it transforms into something that looks less like a river and more like a watercolor painting. The colors of Caño Cristales come from a plant. A single species of aquatic moss-like plant called Mycenaeans clavigera, which grows on the rocky riverbed in conditions of very specific water temperature, water speed, and sunlight. When all of these conditions are met, typically from late July to November, the plant produces a brilliance of red and pink colors that, combined with the yellow of the sand, the green of the moss in the shallower areas, the black of the rock, and the crystal blue of the water itself, creates a spectacle of natural color that is genuinely unlike anything else on Earth. The river runs through rapids and falls and still pools, each section displaying a slightly different color palette depending on the depth of the water, the density of the plant growth, and the angle of the light. It is one of those rare natural phenomena that seems designed specifically to be beautiful, even though it is, of course, the product of nothing more than the intersection of geology, hydrology, and biology in a very specific and very particular way. Caño Cristales is inaccessible for much of the year, not only because of the seasonal nature of the colors, but because of the logistical difficulties of reaching a remote mountain river in the Colombian interior. But for those who make the journey during the peak season, the experience is described by everyone who has seen it as one of the most overwhelming natural spectacles they have ever witnessed. The river does not merely look different from any other river. It looks, in the words of more than one visitor, like something from another world. As we draw toward the end of the first half of our journey, let us return one more time to the ocean and to the extraordinary diversity of life that it contains. Because we have talked about the hydrothermal vent communities and their tube worms and their blind shrimp and their chemosynthetic bacteria, but the deep ocean is home to other extraordinary life forms as well, creatures that have evolved in complete isolation from the world of sunlight, and have developed adaptations so strange and so counterintuitive that they seem, to surface-dwelling minds, almost impossible. Among the most remarkable of the deep sea's permanent residents are the giant isopods. Isopods are a group of crustaceans that includes the familiar pill bug or roly-poly, those small oval insects that roll into balls when disturbed and live under rocks and logs in gardens around the world. In the deep ocean, the principle of deep-sea gigantism applies, meaning that many invertebrate species that are small at the surface are represented by much larger cousins in the deep. The giant isopods of the genus Bathynomus represent the principle of deep-sea gigantism in its most dramatic form. Where their shallow water cousins measure a centimeter or two, giant isopods can reach lengths of over 40 centimeters, roughly 16 inches. They look like enormous pill bugs with their armored, segmented bodies and their multiple pairs of legs, and they live in the cold, dark waters of the deep Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans, at depths ranging from several hundred to several thousand meters. Giant isopods are scavengers, feeding primarily on the carcasses of dead fish, whales, and other marine animals that drift down to the seafloor. They are extraordinarily efficient eaters, capable of consuming enormous quantities of food when it is available, and then surviving for months or even years without eating at all. They can slow their metabolism to a degree that makes even extreme food deprivation survivable for very long periods. One captive giant isopod at an aquarium in Japan reportedly survived for over 5 years without eating before finally dying. And then there is the creature sometimes called the alien sponge, not an actual scientific name, but a descriptor that captures the quality of strangeness that characterizes many of the deep sea's most unusual inhabitants. The deep ocean is home to a variety of sponges, those most ancient and most morphologically simple of multicellular animals, and some of the deepest and most remote of these sponges have evolved forms that bear virtually no resemblance to the sponge shapes familiar from shallow water environments. Some deep-sea sponges grow into shapes of extraordinary complexity and apparent deliberateness, forms that to human eyes suggest deliberate design rather than biological growth. Vase shapes of astonishing precision, branching structures of crystalline glass made literally from silica, the same material as glass which the sponge extracts from the seawater and incorporates into its skeleton. Some deep-sea glass sponges are among the longest-lived organisms on Earth, with some individuals estimated to be over 10,000 years old, making them older than the oldest known trees, older than many of the civilizations we have been discussing in this documentary, potentially contemporary with whatever ancient civilization left the story of Atlantis in human memory. The ocean is, in summary, extraordinary beyond any simple description. It is the largest environment on Earth, the most poorly explored, the most biologically diverse, and the most historically rich. It contains the ruins of human civilizations, the treasures of lost empires, the fossils of extinct creatures, the record of millions of years of geological history, and ecosystems of a complexity and strangeness that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about what life is and where it can exist. And it is still, despite all the centuries of human exploration and all the decades of scientific investigation, mostly unknown, mostly unexplored, mostly beyond the reach of human eyes and human instruments. The second part of our journey will take us deeper still into more of the ocean's extraordinary secrets, into more of the stories that the deep water holds, and back to the greatest treasure hunts and the most compelling mysteries that the seafloor has yielded or withheld. We will return to the question of Atlantis, and we will explore what the continuing investigation of the world's oceans and the world's history is revealing about the possibility of lost civilizations. We will descend to the volcanic seamounts that threaten to reshape the ocean floor. We will follow the extraordinary recovery of pirate treasures and the exploration of submerged cities. And we will ask the question that underlies all of these explorations, the question that sends people into the ocean in submersibles and into archives in search of faded manuscripts and into the field in pursuit of evidence that most of the world says does not exist. What is down there? What have we lost to the deep water? What would we find if we could truly see the bottom of the sea? These are the questions that have driven human curiosity from the very beginnings of recorded history. The ancient Greeks wrote of the terrors of the deep ocean and of the gods that governed it. Medieval sailors trembled at the thought of the creatures that lurked in the unexplored waters beyond the edges of their charts. In the 19th century, when the first scientific expeditions began systematically studying the deep sea, the discoveries they made were so startling that they seemed to verify every legend and nightmare that had preceded them. And in our own era, with all the technology and all the accumulated knowledge of centuries of exploration at our disposal, we are still repeatedly finding things in the ocean that surprise us, that confound our assumptions, that expand our understanding of what is possible in the natural world. The ocean is not finished surprising us. It has not given up all its secrets. The lost cities are still down there, and the sunken treasures, and the geological wonders, and the creatures of the deep. And somewhere in the quiet darkness 2.5 miles below the surface of the North Atlantic, the bow of the Titanic is still embedded in the mud, pointing toward the bottom, surrounded by the shoes and the bottles and the personal effects of the 1,500 people who died when the great ship went down, waiting for the day when the bacteria finally finished their slow work and the last remnants of the most famous shipwreck in history dissolved back into the chemistry of the sea. But that day has not come yet. There is still time to go back down, still time to look, still time to find what is waiting in the deep water, in the darkness, in the silence. Still time to discover what the ocean has been keeping all this time from the light. The ocean has no memory of the things it has swallowed. It does not mark the graves of the ships it has claimed, or the cities it has buried, or the civilizations it has consumed. It simply continues, moving and breathing and grinding away at the evidence of human existence with the same patient, absolute indifference it has shown to everything that has ever fallen into its embrace. And yet the ocean is also the greatest keeper of secrets that has ever existed, because what it takes, it very often keeps. Preserved in cold and darkness, shielded from the forces of erosion and decay that destroy surface evidence of the past, the things the ocean has swallowed can endure for centuries, for millennia, for timescales that dwarf the entire span of recorded human history. In the first part of our journey, we traveled to the Azores and the Sahara Desert in search of Atlantis. We descended to the hydrothermal vents where life flourishes in impossible conditions. We explored the streets of Pavlopetri and listened to the strange acoustic mystery of the Bloop. And we followed the most famous treasure hunt in history to the moment when Mel Fisher finally found what he had been looking for on the ocean floor. Now we go deeper, we go further. We return to the questions that the first part of our journey raised, and we push them harder, asking not just what we have found in the ocean, but what those discoveries mean, not just where the lost cities might be, but why they matter, not just how the treasures got to the bottom of the sea, but what they tell us about the civilizations that sent them there. And we will encounter along the way the living ocean itself, the ocean not as a graveyard of human history, but as a dynamic, powerful, and sometimes violent geological force that is still, right now, in this moment, reshaping the floor of the sea in ways that will matter profoundly to the human world above the waterline. The ocean is not finished with us. It never was. And the volcanoes that build new seafloor from the interior of the earth, and the seamounts that rise from the abyssal plain toward the surface, and the geological processes that have drowned coastlines and created new islands throughout human history are all still operating, still changing the world, still writing the next chapter of the story that began when the first liquid water pooled on the surface of this planet 4 billion years ago. Take a breath. We are going back under. Let us begin this second half of our journey by returning to the question of Atlantis, but approaching it from a different angle. We have talked about where Atlantis might have been. Now let us talk about the broader question of whether the kind of civilization Plato described, a highly sophisticated maritime empire existing thousands of years before the earliest civilizations recognized by mainstream archaeology, is even theoretically possible. Because the answer to that question has implications that go far beyond the specific legend of Atlantis and touch on some of the most fundamental debates in the study of human prehistory. The conventional picture of human civilization, the one taught in schools and described in textbooks, goes something like this. For most of our species' existence, roughly 200,000 years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, moving across the landscape in small bands, following the animals and the seasonal availability of plant foods, building no permanent structures and leaving little enduring archaeological trace. Then, beginning about 12,000 years ago in the ancient Near East and gradually spreading outward from there, human societies began to develop agriculture. They settled in permanent villages, domesticated animals, developed pottery and weaving and other technologies of settled life. Slowly, over the following millennia, some of these agricultural communities developed into larger and more complex social organizations, with specialized labor, social hierarchies, trade networks, and eventually writing, monumental architecture, and all the other attributes we associate with civilization. The first recognizable civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt appeared roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, and before that the conventional view holds there was nothing. No cities, no complex societies, no maritime empires, just scattered bands of hunter-gatherers and early agricultural communities. This picture has been challenged repeatedly and with increasing force by a series of archaeological discoveries made in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, discoveries that suggest the timeline of human cultural and social complexity is considerably older than the conventional model assumes. Perhaps the most dramatic of these challenges came from a site in southern Turkey, on a low hilltop called Göbekli Tepe, which translates roughly as Potbelly Hill. Excavations at Göbekli Tepe, which began in earnest in the 1990s under German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, revealed a series of stone circles and rectangular enclosures filled with massive carved limestone pillars, some of them over 5 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons, decorated with elaborately carved relief sculptures of animals, birds, insects, and abstract symbols. The scale, the sophistication, and the artistic quality of these carvings were breathtaking by any standard, but the most remarkable thing about Göbekli Tepe was its age. The site dates to approximately 11,500 years ago, placing it at the very end of the last ice age, in the period just before the first evidence of agriculture in the region. According to the conventional model of prehistory, the people who built Göbekli Tepe should have been hunter-gatherers, too nomadic and too busy finding food to devote enormous amounts of time and coordinated labor to building monumental stone structures. Yet there it is, 11,500 years old, massively built, elaborately decorated, requiring the coordination of large numbers of workers over extended periods of time. It should not exist according to the conventional timeline, and yet it does. Göbekli Tepe did not immediately overturn the conventional model of prehistory, but it did open a crack in the consensus through which a great deal of new thinking has begun to flow. If people 12,000 years ago were capable of organizing the labor required to build Göbekli Tepe, what else were they capable of? If the cognitive and organizational capacities for large-scale cooperative construction existed this early, could they also have supported seafaring, trade, and complex social organization? Could they have supported something that, in retrospect, we might recognize as the beginning of civilization? And here is where the connection to Atlantis becomes particularly interesting. Because the date at which Göbekli Tepe was built overlaps almost precisely with the date at which Plato placed the destruction of Atlantis. 9,000 years before Solon's time means approximately 11,500 years ago. The same moment in prehistory when we can now prove that people were capable of building stone monuments of extraordinary scale and sophistication. Plato's Egyptian priests described a great maritime civilization being swallowed by the sea. The coincidence of timing is striking enough to make even skeptical researchers pause. There is, of course, a vast difference between proving that people 12,000 years ago could build stone circles and proving that they built a civilization of the type Plato described. The gap between Göbekli Tepe, impressive as it is, and a maritime empire with concentric ring cities and bronze metallurgy, and a naval fleet capable of projecting power across the entire Mediterranean, that gap is enormous. But the discovery of Göbekli Tepe has demonstrated something crucial, that our assumptions about what was possible in the deep human past need to be held more lightly than they have been. The past keeps surprising us. The evidence keeps pushing the boundaries of what we thought we knew. And it is in this spirit of open inquiry, of refusing to let the conventional model foreclose investigation, that the most serious researchers in the field of underwater archaeology continue their work. Not with the assumption that Atlantis was real, but with the recognition that the ocean floor contains evidence of a past that we have barely begun to understand, and that the only way to understand it is to go and look. One of the places that researchers have gone to look, in the hope of finding evidence of very early human coastal activity, is beneath the waters of the Black Sea. The Black Sea, which lies between Eastern Europe and Western Asia, is one of the world's most remarkable bodies of water for several reasons, not least of which is its extraordinary history of dramatic environmental change in the not-too-distant past. Today, the Black Sea is connected to the Mediterranean through the narrow straits of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, but this has not always been the case. During the last ice age, when sea levels across the world were dramatically lower, the Black Sea was a landlocked freshwater lake, cut off from the salty Mediterranean by a land barrier across what is now the Bosphorus. The lake was smaller than the current Black Sea, and its shores were ringed with settlements of early hunter-gatherers and later, early agricultural communities who found the lake shore to be a productive and hospitable environment. Then, somewhere around 7,700 years ago, the rising waters of the Mediterranean finally overtopped the land barrier at the Bosphorus and broke through. The marine water of the Mediterranean began to pour into the freshwater lake of the Proto-Black Sea with enormous force, essentially the largest waterfall in human history, a cascade of salt water that geologists estimate may have flowed with a force 200 times greater than Niagara Falls. The lake level rose rapidly, perhaps by as much as 15 centimeters a day, flooding the shores that had been inhabited for millennia and driving the people who lived there to higher ground. The flooding may have continued for months or years, covering enormous areas of what had been productive, inhabited land with the waters of a newly formed inland sea. The hypothesis that this catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea is the origin of the great flood myths found in so many cultures around the world, including the story of Noah's Ark in the Bible and the earlier story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, was proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the 1990s and has generated significant debate. But beyond the question of flood mythology, the Black Sea flood event is significant for a very different reason. The land that was inundated when the sea rose was land that had been inhabited by people. Those people had settlements, villages, perhaps more, and those settlements are now under the water of the Black Sea. The Black Sea has a unique characteristic that makes it potentially the best place in the world for preserving ancient organic remains on the seafloor. Below a depth of about 150 to 200 meters, the Black Sea is anoxic, meaning it contains no dissolved oxygen. Without oxygen, the bacteria that normally break down organic material cannot survive and cannot do their work. Wood, leather, textile, bone, all the organic materials that disappear quickly in well-oxygenated water are preserved almost indefinitely in the anoxic depths of the Black Sea. Ships that sank in the deep Black Sea thousands of years ago are sitting on the seafloor with their timbers intact, their rigging still in place, their cargoes undisturbed. It is the most extraordinary natural preservation environment in the world. Expeditions to the deep Black Sea have confirmed this extraordinary preservation in spectacular fashion. Ancient shipwrecks have been found in conditions of preservation that are almost inconceivable by the standards of other underwater archaeological environments. One Byzantine trading vessel discovered at a depth of over 2,000 meters had its hull timbers in near-perfect condition, its deck fittings still in place, its internal structure intact after more than 1,000 years on the seafloor. The sight of such a well-preserved ancient ship sitting on the deep seafloor, lit by the artificial lights of the ROV, is described by researchers as one of the most moving experiences in archaeology, a direct connection to the people who built and sailed the vessel, bridging 1,000 years of time with the immediacy of physical presence. But it is not just the ships of the historical era that interest researchers in the Black Sea. It is also the possibility that the flooded shoreline of the pre-flood lake, now lying under the shallower waters of the Black Sea, may preserve evidence of the communities that were overwhelmed when the Mediterranean broke through. Expeditions have found what appear to be ancient shoreline features at depths consistent with the pre-flood lake level, including what some researchers have interpreted as the remains of human-built structures. If these interpretations are correct, the Black Sea contains evidence of human habitation going back 7,000 years or more, preserved in conditions that would allow detailed investigation of communities that predated all known Bronze Age civilizations. The implications for our understanding of early human history are significant. The people who lived on the shores of the pre-flood Black Sea Lake were farming, building structures, and organizing complex communities at a time when the conventional model of prehistory places sophisticated civilization nowhere in the region. If the flooded shoreline yields genuine archaeological evidence of substantial habitation, it will add another data point to the growing body of evidence suggesting that the conventional timeline of human civilizational development needs significant revision. Let us now turn from the waters of the Black Sea to an entirely different kind of underwater environment, one that is not ancient but very much alive and geologically active, one that represents the ocean's capacity for creation rather than preservation. Let us talk about the volcanoes that build the seafloor and the seamounts that rise from the deep and occasionally breach the surface to create new land where before there was only water. The ocean floor is not a static, unchanging landscape. It is the product of continuous geological processes, of the upwelling of magma from the Earth's interior along the mid-ocean ridges, of the constant creation of new seafloor as the tectonic plates spread apart, and of the destruction of old seafloor as one plate dives beneath another in the process called subduction. The ocean floor is, in geological terms, relatively young, constantly being recycled through the geological cycle of creation and destruction. And the volcanoes that drive this process are not merely features of the seafloor. They are the architects of the seafloor, the engines of geological change, the machines by which the interior heat of the Earth is expressed at the surface of the planet. Of all the underwater volcanoes in the world, one of the most closely watched, the most extensively monitored, and in recent years the most geologically active, is a seamount located in the northeastern Pacific Ocean, about 480 kilometers off the coast of Oregon. This seamount is called Axial Seamount, and it is part of the Juan de Fuca Ridge, one of the most active sections of the mid-ocean ridge system in the Pacific. Axial Seamount rises from the surrounding ocean floor to a summit at a depth of about 1,500 meters below the surface, making it technically an underwater mountain of substantial size. And it has been showing signs of impending volcanic activity that have made it one of the most intensively monitored geological features in the world. Axial Seamount has erupted multiple times in recent history. Eruptions were documented in 1998 and in 2011, and a further eruption occurred in 2015. Each eruption deposited new lava flows across the flanks of the seamount and added new material to its summit. The 2015 eruption was particularly well documented because by that time, the seamount had been instrumented with an extraordinary array of sensors and monitoring equipment as part of the Ocean Observatory's initiative, a major scientific infrastructure project that has turned the area around Axial Seamount into what scientists call the most wired section of the deep ocean floor in the world. The monitoring equipment at Axial Seamount includes seismometers that detect the smallest earthquakes in the rock beneath the seamount, pressure sensors that measure changes in the depth of the seafloor itself, which shifts measurably as magma accumulates in or drains from the magma chamber beneath, hydrophones that listen to the acoustic signatures of volcanic activity, and chemical sensors that track the composition of the water near the hydrothermal vents that are found in abundance on the seamount's summit. All of this data is transmitted continuously via fiber optic cable to shore, where scientists can monitor the state of the volcano in real time from their offices and laboratories on land. The result is an unprecedented level of insight into the behavior of an underwater volcano. Scientists watching the data from Axial Seamount have been able to track the inflation of the seamount as magma accumulates beneath it, predicting with some precision when the pressure will be sufficient to cause an eruption. They observed the deflation of the summit during the 2015 eruption as the magma chamber emptied. They tracked the seismic swarm that preceded the eruption, the thousands of small earthquakes that occur as the rock fractures under the pressure of the rising magma. And they have been able to study, in something approaching real time, the profound effects that an underwater volcanic eruption has on the surrounding ecosystem. Because the hydrothermal vents of axial seamount are not merely geological features. They are ecosystems, communities of living organisms that depend on the heat and the chemicals from the vents for their survival. When the seamount erupts, the lava flows bury some of these vent communities, destroying them entirely. But remarkably, the eruption also creates new vent habitats, opening new pathways for the heated, chemical-rich water to reach the seafloor, creating new platforms on which the chemosynthetic bacteria that form the base of the vent ecosystem can establish themselves. And the recovery of these ecosystems after a major eruption, the speed with which life returns to lava-covered seafloor, and the succession of organisms that colonize it over time, is itself a major subject of scientific study that has profound implications for our understanding of how life colonizes new environments and how ecosystems recover from catastrophic disturbance. The scientific value of axial seamount as a natural laboratory is extraordinary. But it also raises a more sobering question. The Juan de Fuca Ridge, of which axial seamount is part of a broader system of tectonic plate interactions along the coast of the Pacific Northwest. The Cascadia subduction zone, where the Juan de Fuca plate dives beneath the North American plate, is one of the most seismically hazardous regions in the world. The last great earthquake on the Cascadia subduction zone occurred in January of 1700, producing a magnitude 9 earthquake and a tsunami that devastated the Pacific coast and was recorded in historical documents in Japan. Geologists believe that the Cascadia subduction zone is capable of producing another earthquake of similar magnitude, and the monitoring of axial seamount and the broader Juan de Fuca Ridge is part of the effort to understand the behavior of this geological system and provide warning of future events. The ocean floor, in other words, is not just a repository of the past. It is also the stage on which the geological future of the Earth is being written. The volcanoes that built the Hawaiian Islands from the bottom of the Pacific, the seamounts that have grown from the abyssal plain to within striking distance of the surface, the mid-ocean ridges that are spreading apart at rates of a few centimeters per year, all of these processes are ongoing, continuous, and consequential. The ocean floor is alive in the most literal geological sense, constantly in motion, constantly changing, constantly building new features and destroying old ones in the great slow churn of plate tectonics. And speaking of features that appear and disappear on the geological timescale, let us return once more to the question of lost civilizations, but approach it this time through the specific evidence that coastal inundation and sea level change have left in the archaeological record around the world. Because the evidence for prehistoric coastal flooding is not merely theoretical. It is not merely extrapolated from geological models and climate data. It is written in concrete physical archaeological evidence that researchers have found in dozens of locations around the world. And the picture that evidence paints is one of dramatic, repeated, sometimes catastrophic change in the geography of the coastal world during the period immediately following the end of the last ice age. We have already discussed the Black Sea flood event and its implications. But the global sea level rise that followed the end of the last ice age was not a gradual, smooth, even process. It was punctuated by episodes of dramatically accelerated rise triggered by the sudden collapse of major ice sheets. One of these episodes, called Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred approximately 14,400 years ago and involved a rise in global sea level of somewhere between 15 and 20 meters in a period of perhaps 500 years or less. That is a rise of 3 or 4 centimeters per year, or roughly a meter every 25 to 30 years. For coastal communities, that kind of sea level rise would have been visible and felt within a single human lifetime. Villages that were built near the shore would have needed to be relocated. Harbor facilities would have become increasingly difficult to use. Fishing grounds would have shifted. The geography of the coast would have changed noticeably from generation to generation. And this is just one of several such episodes. There appear to have been at least 4 major meltwater pulse events during the deglaciation period, each involving rapid, dramatic sea level rise over relatively short timescales. The total sea level rise from the glacial maximum to the current sea level is estimated at about 120 to 130 meters, roughly 400 feet. That is an enormous amount of water that was added to the world's oceans over the course of the deglaciation period, and it inundated an enormous area of what had been dry land. The total area of land inundated since the last glacial maximum is estimated at something on the order of 27 million square kilometers, an area comparable to the entire continent of Africa. All of that inundated land was, at various points during the deglaciation, potentially habitable. Some of it was certainly inhabited. The continental shelves, which are the shallow underwater extensions of the continents that were exposed as dry land during the glacial maximum, include some of the most potentially productive agricultural environments imaginable. The broad, flat, well-watered plains of the exposed continental shelf would have been, in the right climate conditions, extraordinarily suitable for early agricultural societies. And we know that these areas were occupied because we have found artifacts and remains of human activity on the continental shelves in multiple locations around the world. In the North Sea between Britain and continental Europe, marine archaeologists and fossil hunters have found stone tools, the bones of land animals including mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, and even the remains of human activity dating to the period when the North Sea basin was dry land, a vast plain that some researchers have called Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank, a shallow region that was one of the last areas to be submerged. Doggerland was a rich hunting and gathering territory, home to large populations of Mesolithic people who exploited its marshes, rivers, and uplands. When the North Sea flooded, those people retreated to higher ground, and the world they had known disappeared beneath the water. It is one of the best documented examples of the inundation of a prehistoric landscape, and it has produced real, tangible archaeological evidence of the people who lived there before the water came. Similar evidence has been found in the Gulf of Mexico, where submerged prehistoric landscapes have yielded stone tools and other artifacts. In the waters off the coast of India, structures identified by some researchers as ancient have been found at depths suggesting a very early age. In the Mediterranean, the drowned landscapes of the continental shelf have in many areas been inadequately investigated, but have produced tantalizingly suggestive sonar and sediment data. And around the coast of Australia, where the continental shelf is extensive, and where the evidence of sea level rise since the last glacial maximum is well documented, the flooded continental shelf may contain the largest underwater archaeological landscape in the world. All of this is relevant to the question of Atlantis, not because any of these sites is necessarily Atlantis, but because it demonstrates conclusively that the basic premise of the Atlantis legend, the idea of a substantial inhabited land area being swallowed by the sea, is not the fantasy that it might initially seem. It happened, many times, to many communities all around the world. The ocean did take real places from real people, and the memory of that loss may well have been preserved in the collective human cultural memory in the form of flood stories, legends of sunken cities, and perhaps the specific story of Atlantis that Plato recorded. Now let us turn our attention to one of the most famous and fascinating of the historically documented lost cities, a city whose loss was not ancient and legendary but relatively recent and very well recorded, a city that went to the bottom in the most dramatic fashion imaginable, and that has been the subject of underwater archaeological investigation for well over a century. we are going to visit Port Royal. Port Royal was a city that sat at the tip of a narrow spit of land on the southern coast of Jamaica, controlling the entrance to the harbor of Kingston Bay. In the second half of the 17th century, it was one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the Caribbean, a major trading hub for the plantation economy of the British West Indies, and somewhat more notoriously, one of the most important bases for privateers and pirates operating in the Caribbean Sea. The city had a population of several thousand people, packed into a dense warren of warehouses, taverns, merchants' houses, goldsmiths' shops, brothels, and churches on a narrow piece of land barely a kilometer wide. Contemporary accounts describe it as one of the richest cities in the world, its warehouses stuffed with the goods of colonial trade, its inhabitants living with a rawness and a vitality and a capacity for violence that reflected the rough-hewn nature of the Caribbean colonial frontier. It was also, as events would prove, sitting on extremely unstable ground. On the morning of June 7, 1692, a massive earthquake struck Jamaica. Contemporary accounts describe the ground shaking with tremendous violence, buildings collapsing, and then most catastrophically, the sand on which much of Port Royal was built liquefying in the seismic shock and the entire tip of the spit dropping into the harbor. The northwestern portion of the city, packed with buildings, people, and the accumulated wealth of decades of trade, slid into the sea. Within minutes, 2,000 people were dead, either crushed in collapsing buildings, drowned as the land disappeared beneath them, or killed in the chaos that followed. Further deaths from disease and injury in the days after the earthquake brought the total death toll to around 5,000, more than half the city's population. What remained of Port Royal above the waterline was devastated, and the city never recovered its former prominence. Gradually, the center of gravity of Jamaican trade and commerce shifted to Kingston, and Port Royal became a shadow of its former self. But the two-thirds of Port Royal that slid into the harbor in 1692 did not disappear. It settled on the bottom of Kingston Harbor in relatively shallow water, and there it has remained ever since. The same liquefaction of the ground that caused the city to sink also, in a remarkable parallel to the story of Pavlopetri, preserved much of what sank. Buildings, streets, artifacts, and the remarkable material culture of a late 17th century Caribbean port city were buried in the harbor mud, protected from erosion and from the disturbance of the surface world. Underwater archaeological investigations of the sunken portion of Port Royal have been ongoing since the 1950s, initially conducted by pioneer underwater archaeologist Edwin Link and later by teams from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology and other institutions. What they found was extraordinary in its completeness. Unlike most archaeological sites where material from different periods is mixed together and the original context of objects has been disturbed by later activity, the sunken portion of Port Royal preserves a single moment in time, June 7, 1692, with a precision that no surface site could match. Objects are where they were when the earthquake struck. Dishes are still on the shelves where they sat. Tools are still in the workshops where they were being used. The contents of warehouses are still in the positions they occupied when the ground gave way. Among the most remarkable finds from the sunken city were complete sets of tableware, pewter plates and cups and serving dishes, some still stacked neatly as they had been stored. There were clay pipes still packed in the cases in which they had been shipped. There were glass bottles, wine bottles and medicine bottles and perfume bottles. There were copper kettles and brass candlesticks and iron tools of every description. There was a gold watch, its hands stopped at 17 minutes to 12, which corroborates contemporary accounts suggesting that the earthquake struck in the late morning. And there was, perhaps most poignantly, the personal belongings of the people who had lived and worked in this city, their small everyday objects, the material evidence of their ordinary lives. Port Royal offers us something that most historical sites cannot, a complete cross-section of a 17th century Caribbean port city, preserved in the moment of its destruction with a completeness and a specificity that makes it one of the most valuable archaeological sites in the world. It tells us about trade, about material culture, about daily life, about the goods that circulated in the colonial economy with a directness that no written record can match. And it does so from beneath the water, preserved by the same catastrophe that destroyed the living city, kept safe by the harbor mud for over 3 centuries, until the archaeologists came with their airlifts and their cataloging sheets and their underwater cameras and began, carefully and systematically, to reveal what the earthquake had buried. The story of Port Royal reminds us that not all lost cities are ancient. Not all submerged history belongs to the remote past. The same forces of geological catastrophe and rising water that swept away Pavlopetri 5,000 years ago and may have destroyed a civilization 10,000 years ago continued to operate throughout the historical period, swallowing coastlines and cities and harbors and ports and events that were recorded and mourned by the people who survived them. The ocean's appetite for human construction is not a thing of the past. It is ongoing, it is present. And in a world of changing climate and rising sea levels, it is perhaps more relevant to human civilization now than it has been for thousands of years. But before we descend into the implications of current sea level change, let us return to treasure, because the ocean floor is not only a repository of history and archaeology. It is also, in the most literal and tangible sense, a vault, one that is filled with the material wealth of centuries of maritime commerce, of colonial extraction, of the movement of goods and money around the world on ships that were always at the mercy of weather and navigation, and the simple, terrible bad luck that has always attended human ventures at sea. We told the story of the Nuestra Señora de Atocha in the first part of our journey. But the Atocha was not alone on the ocean floor, and Mel Fisher was not the only person to find extraordinary treasure in the deep water. The history of maritime treasure recovery is long and varied and full of stories that are, in their own way, as dramatic and as human as the story of Fisher and his 16-year search. The Spanish galleon system that produced the Atocha also produced dozens of other major wrecks, ships that went down in the Florida Straits, in the Bahamas, in the waters of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, carrying their cargoes of silver and gold and gems to the seafloor. Many of these wrecks have been found and their cargoes partially or fully recovered. Others remain on the ocean floor, their locations unknown, their treasures still waiting. The scale of the wealth that the Spanish colonial system extracted from the Americas and attempted to transport to Europe is almost impossible to comprehend in modern terms. The silver mines of Potosi in what is now Bolivia, the richest silver deposit ever discovered, produced an estimated 41,000 tons of silver between 1545 and 1800. A significant portion of this silver was transported to Spain in the annual fleets. A significant portion of what was transported sank with the ships that carried it. The ocean floor of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico and the Florida Straits is quite literally carpeted with silver, lying on the seafloor in the form of ingots and coins and bars and jewelry, waiting for the technology and the investment and the sheer will to recover it. But treasure hunting is not only about the Spanish Main. In every ocean, in every sea, there are ships that went down carrying cargoes of extraordinary value. In the South China Sea, where maritime trade routes have been among the busiest in the world for thousands of years, the seafloor contains an extraordinary concentration of shipwrecks from the great trading civilizations of Asia. Chinese junks, Arab dhows, Portuguese carracks, Dutch East India Company ships, all of them carrying the goods of the Asian trade, the porcelain and the silk and the spices and the precious metals that made the sea routes of the East the most commercially important maritime corridors in the world for centuries. Many of these wrecks have been found, and they have yielded treasures of a very different kind from the silver and gold of the Spanish galleons. The Chinese porcelain that has been recovered from South China Sea wrecks is of extraordinary quality, much of it produced in the imperial kilns and intended for the export market, pieces that in their original context would have been luxury goods of the highest order. Some of these pieces, recovered from the deep water after centuries on the seabed, are in near perfect condition, their glazes bright, their forms undamaged, their decorations as crisp as the day they were fired in the kiln. The ceramic is impervious to water and to the chemistry of the sea, and it survives the deep ocean environment almost indefinitely. The recovery of these pieces has been controversial, as has much maritime treasure recovery. The tension between the interests of commercial salvagers, who see the shipwrecks of the world as sources of valuable objects to be recovered and sold, and the interests of archaeologists and historians, who see them as irreplaceable historical sites to be studied in context and preserved for the benefit of all humanity, is one of the most heated debates in the field of underwater heritage. Commercial salvage, even when conducted with the best intentions, can destroy the archaeological context of a site, the precise three-dimensional relationships between objects and features that tell archaeologists so much more than the objects themselves. Once that context is gone, it is gone forever. The legal and ethical framework governing underwater cultural heritage has evolved significantly over the past several decades, and many countries now have strong laws protecting underwater archaeological sites from unauthorized excavation and commercial exploitation. But the enforcement of these laws in international waters is extremely difficult, and the temptation represented by billions of dollars worth of treasure on the ocean floor is not easily resisted. The debate between treasure hunters and archaeologists continues, and it is one with genuine stakes, not just for the historical record, but for the cultural heritage of the nations whose ships and whose goods lie on the ocean floor. Let us travel now from the warm waters of the tropics to the extreme cold of the deep ocean, and return to the extraordinary creatures that live there. We have talked about tube worms and giant isopods and glass sponges, but the deep sea has many more extraordinary inhabitants that deserve attention. Among the most remarkable is a creature called the barrel-eye fish, or Macropina microstoma, a small, translucent fish of the deep North Pacific whose most extraordinary feature is a pair of eyes that are not merely extraordinary in their sensitivity, but are extraordinary in their physical configuration. The barrel-eye has a transparent, fluid-filled dome on top of its head, and within that dome, two bright green cylindrical structures that are its eyes, pointing upward. For a long time, scientists assumed that these eyes were fixed in their upward pointing orientation, presumably allowing the fish to look upward for the silhouettes of prey against the faint light filtering down from the surface above. But research conducted with remotely operated vehicles showed something remarkable. The eyes can rotate within the transparent dome. The fish can look upward when scanning for prey above it, and can then rotate its eyes to look forward when it is ready to capture that prey. The transparent dome is not merely decorative. It is a protective covering for the most sensitive and sophisticated visual organs in the deep ocean environment. The barrel-eye's eyes are extraordinarily sensitive to light. They contain far more light-gathering capacity than the human eye, allowing the fish to detect the faint, diffuse light that penetrates to the depths where it lives. But they can also be blinded by bright light, which is why they evolved the protective dome. It is an extraordinary piece of biological engineering, a solution to the challenge of seeing in near total darkness that evolution has arrived at through millions of years of incremental refinement. Then there is the Dumbo octopus, named for the ear-like fins on either side of its mantle that it uses for swimming in the same way that the fictional elephant flapped its ears to fly. Dumbo octopuses are the deepest living of all known octopus species, found at depths of up to 7,000 meters in all the world's oceans. They are small, rarely more than 30 centimeters long, and they drift through the deep water in a manner that seems more leisurely than purposeful, using their fins to maneuver and their arms to capture the small crustaceans and worms that make up their diet. They are also, by the standards of deep-sea creatures, improbably adorable, with their round bodies and their flapping ear fins giving them an appearance that is entirely at odds with the extreme environment in which they live. The deep sea is also home to creatures of extraordinary antiquity. The coelacanth, a large, lobe-finned fish that was thought to have gone extinct 65 million years ago with the dinosaurs, was discovered alive and swimming off the coast of South Africa in 1938, one of the most shocking biological discoveries of the 20th century. The living coelacanths found in the deep waters off eastern Africa and Indonesia are almost identical to their fossil relatives, having changed remarkably little in 65 million years. They represent a lineage of life that the surface world thought was gone forever, surviving in the depths of the ocean where the conditions that caused their surface relatives to go extinct apparently did not reach. The nautilus is another example of an ancient lineage that has survived in the deep ocean while its relatives went extinct. Nautiluses are the last surviving members of a group of cephalopods that were enormously diverse and abundant in ancient seas and that are known primarily from their fossil record. The spiral shells of ammonites, the nautilus's extinct relatives, are among the most commonly found fossils in the world, suggesting that these animals were once extraordinarily numerous. Today, all the ammonites are gone, but a few species of nautilus survive in the deep Pacific and Indian Oceans, living very much as their ancestors lived hundreds of millions of years ago. They are, in a very real sense, living fossils, survivors of the deep ocean who have outlasted the mass extinctions and the geological upheavals and the dramatic environmental changes of hundreds of millions of years of Earth history. The deep ocean, it seems, is not only a place of extraordinary biological invention. It is also a place of extraordinary biological conservation, a refuge where ancient life forms can persist long after their surface equivalents have been replaced by more modern species. The deep ocean is, in this sense, a natural museum, a living record of evolutionary history that spans hundreds of millions of years. There's another category of deep-sea wonder that we have not yet fully explored, and it is one that connects directly to some of the most fundamental questions in Earth science. We have talked about hydrothermal vents, where hot water laced with minerals jets from the seafloor. But there is another, very different type of hydrothermal feature in the deep ocean that is equally remarkable, and that has some extraordinary characteristics of its own. These are the cold seeps. Cold seeps are areas of the seafloor where hydrocarbon-rich fluids, primarily methane and hydrogen sulfide, seep upward through the sediment from deep reservoirs beneath the ocean floor. Unlike hydrothermal vents, which are driven by the heat of the Earth's interior and which produce water that is scalding hot, cold seeps produce fluids at approximately the ambient temperature of the surrounding deep ocean water. They were first discovered in the Gulf of Mexico in 1984 and have since been found in all the world's oceans, at a wide range of depths and in geological settings as diverse as subduction zones, continental margins, and the flanks of submarine canyons. Like the hydrothermal vents, cold seeps support thriving ecosystems based on chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. The methane and hydrogen sulfide seeping from the seafloor provide the energy source for communities of bacteria, archaea, and other microorganisms, which are in turn eaten by larger organisms including tube worms, clams, mussels, crabs, and fish. The communities of organisms found at cold seeps overlap significantly with those found at hydrothermal vents, though there are important differences reflecting the different chemical environments. One of the most extraordinary features of cold seep environments is the formation of structures called methane hydrates. When methane under high pressure and low temperature combines with water, it forms a solid ice-like compound called methane hydrate, or sometimes methane clathrate. This compound is stable only under the specific conditions of high pressure and low temperature found in the deep ocean and in permafrost environments. On the seafloor near cold seeps, methane hydrates can form solid outcrops and mounds on the sediment surface, white or pale structures that look remarkably like ice, sometimes large enough to form significant topographic features on the seafloor. The methane hydrates of the deep ocean represent an enormous reservoir of carbon, estimated to be comparable in total quantity to all the known reserves of conventional fossil fuels. The stability of this reservoir is a matter of serious scientific concern in the context of changing ocean temperatures. If ocean temperatures rise sufficiently, the hydrates can destabilize, releasing their methane into the ocean water and potentially into the atmosphere. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, and a large-scale release of methane from destabilizing hydrates could dramatically accelerate the rate of climate change. This process, sometimes called the clathrate gun hypothesis, has been proposed as a mechanism that may have contributed to past episodes of rapid climate warming in Earth's history. Whether it poses a risk in the context of current climate change is a question that researchers are actively investigating. But the methane hydrates also have a more immediately dramatic property that makes them one of the ocean floor's most visually striking features. They burn. When brought to the surface, or when ignited at the seafloor where the pressures are lower and the methane can escape, methane hydrates produce an eerie blue flame, a fire that appears to be burning on ice. The ancient Japanese called them fire ice, and the visual effect of a frozen-looking white substance burning with a cold blue flame is genuinely extraordinary, a reminder that the deep ocean contains physical and chemical phenomena that have no analog in the surface world and that can seem, to eyes accustomed to the ordinary behavior of matter at surface conditions, genuinely otherworldly. As we continue our journey through the deep ocean and its mysteries, let us circle back now to one of the specific locations where the Atlantis mystery intersects with genuine underwater archaeological evidence. We mentioned in our earlier discussion the mysterious underwater structures discovered off the coast of Cuba. We discussed the controversy surrounding these structures, the scientific skepticism about their artificial nature, and the practical difficulties of investigating a site at such depth in such complex political circumstances. But the Cuban site is not the only place in the Caribbean where underwater structures of uncertain origin have been discovered. The most famous of these other Caribbean underwater mysteries is the Bimini Road, a formation of large flat limestone rocks lying on the shallow seafloor off the western coast of North Bimini Island in the Bahamas. The Bimini Road, sometimes called the Bimini Wall, was discovered in 1968 by diver and treasure hunter Joseph Manson Valentine, and when news of the discovery reached the public, the reaction was immediate and sensational. Here, in shallow water that could be explored by ordinary scuba divers, was a linear arrangement of large stone blocks that appeared to form a paved road or wall, extending for about half a mile across the seafloor in neat, regular courses of stones. Valentine and the researchers who initially investigated the site argued passionately that the Bimini Road was an artifact of human construction, a remnant of an ancient civilization, possibly Atlantis itself. The stones were large, typically 1 to 2 meters across and about 30 to 50 centimeters thick. They were arranged in a roughly linear pattern, with the stones fitting together in a way that suggested deliberate placement. At the northern end of the road, the stones appeared to curve or hook, suggesting the end of a wall or the corner of a structure. The visual impression, particularly from underwater photographs taken at the site, was striking. It really did look like a paved road or a wall. The case was bolstered, in the eyes of Atlantis believers, by a remarkable coincidence. In 1968, exactly the year the Bimini Road was discovered, the prophecies of the American psychic Edgar Cayce were recalled by Atlantis enthusiasts. Cayce, who died in 1945, had made numerous prophecies about the eventual discovery of evidence of Atlantis, and among them was a prediction that a portion of Atlantis would rise off the coast of Bimini around the year 1968 or 1969. The year of the discovery matched the prophecy exactly. To Atlantis believers, this seemed like more than coincidence. To skeptics, it was a matter of confirmation bias, of finding meaning in coincidence because meaning was sought. Mainstream geologists who examined the Bimini Road were generally unimpressed by the artificial construction hypothesis. They argued that the stone blocks were a natural geological formation known as beak rock, a type of rock formed when carbonate sediments are cemented together by the precipitation of calcium carbonate from groundwater near the shoreline. Beach rock forms in layers roughly parallel to the beach surface and can fracture along natural joint lines that produce block-like pieces with fairly regular shapes. When sea level rises and covers a beach rock formation, the result can look remarkably like a paved surface because beach rock is, in a sense, naturally pavement-like. Detailed geological analysis of the stones confirmed that they were indeed composed of limestone consistent with beach rock formation, and that the fracture patterns were consistent with natural joint formation rather than artificial cutting. Not everyone accepted this explanation. Researchers who favored the artificial construction hypothesis pointed out specific features of the Bimini Road that they argued were inconsistent with natural beach rock formation. They noted that some of the stones appeared to be of different types of rock, which would be unusual in a natural beach rock formation. They noted that some stones appeared to be elevated on stone supports, as if they had been raised to create a level surface, which seemed unlikely to be the result of natural processes. And they pointed to the overall regularity and linearity of the formation as evidence of deliberate arrangement. The debate about the Bimini Road has never been fully resolved to the satisfaction of all parties. The mainstream geological consensus remains that it is a natural formation, but the formation continues to attract researchers and explorers, and new investigations have occasionally turned up details that reopen the question. Some researchers have reported finding additional stone formations in the vicinity of the Bimini Road that they argue extend the apparent architectural complex far beyond the initially discovered section. Others have conducted carbon dating of shells and organisms found within the stones and have obtained dates that they argue are inconsistent with the natural beach rock interpretation. Whether the Bimini Road is natural or artificial, it sits in water shallow enough that any amateur diver can visit it, and it has a visual quality that is undeniably compelling. It is easy to understand why the discovery captured imaginations in 1968 and why it continues to draw researchers and enthusiasts to the waters of the Bahamas half a century later. It is, at minimum, a remarkable natural formation. At maximum, it is something much more significant. From the warm, shallow, turquoise waters of the Bahamas, let us descend again into the deep ocean, to one of the most extraordinary environments on the planet. We have talked about the hydrothermal vents and their communities of extraordinary life forms. Now let us talk about what lives not near the vents but in the absolute darkness and cold of the abyssal plain, the vast, largely featureless deep ocean floor that covers much of the world's seafloor at depths of between 3,000 and 6,000 meters. The abyssal plain is not, as it was once assumed, a biological desert. It is a sparse environment, certainly, compared to the biological productivity of the shallow coastal ocean. The amount of organic material that reaches the abyssal plain from the sunlit surface waters above is tiny, a slow rain of dead organic particles that scientists call marine snow, the accumulated debris of the biological activity in the waters above. This marine snow is the primary food source for most of the organisms that live on the abyssal plain, and because it is so dilute, the animal life of the abyss tends to be sparse and widely scattered, but sparse does not mean absent. The abyssal plain supports communities of organisms that have adapted to the extreme conditions with remarkable ingenuity. Sea cucumbers, relatives of the starfish and the sea urchin, are among the most abundant animals on the abyssal plain. They move slowly across the seafloor, ingesting sediment and extracting the organic material from it, leaving trails in the mud that are sometimes the only visible evidence of biological activity on the otherwise featureless plain. Some species of abyssal sea cucumber can form large aggregations when food is locally abundant, producing carpets of pale, sausage-shaped animals that cover the seafloor in what looks, from the cameras of an ROV, like an alien landscape. There are also fish in the abyss, though they are very different from the fish of the shallower ocean. Rattles or grenadiers are among the most common and widespread of the deep-sea fish, elongated creatures with large heads and tapering bodies that sweep the seafloor with their chemosensory fins, looking for the carrion and organic debris that constitute their diet. Tripod fish support themselves above the seafloor on elongated fins that act like stilts, positioning themselves in the slight current that moves even in the deepest ocean to intercept the sparse food particles drifting by. And then there are the creatures that visit the abyssal plain from the waters above, drawn by the extraordinary abundance of organic material that accumulates when a large organism dies and sinks to the seafloor. A whale fall, the carcass of a large whale that has sunk to the abyssal plain, creates an oasis of biological richness in an otherwise sparse environment. The carcass is colonized by a succession of organisms over a period of years or decades. First come the mobile scavengers, the hagfish and the sleeper sharks and the rattles, attracted by the smell of the carcass from great distances. They strip the flesh from the bones in a matter of months. Then come the enrichment opportunists, polychaete worms and crustaceans that colonize the bones and the organic rich sediment around the carcass. And finally, remarkably, the bones themselves become colonized by a community of organisms that use the lipids and sulfur compounds within the bone as an energy source, a community that bears striking similarities to the communities of the hydrothermal vents and the cold seeps. A whale fall, it has been suggested, may serve as a series of stepping stones between hydrothermal vent habitats, providing an intermediate environment that allows the specialized organisms of the vent communities to disperse across the otherwise inhospitable abyssal plain. As we approach the conclusion of our journey through the mysteries of the deep ocean, let us consider one more time the great question that has run like a thread through everything we have discussed. Is Atlantis real? Is there, somewhere beneath the water, the evidence of a civilization that existed before the ones we know? And if the answer is yes, what would it mean for our understanding of human history? The honest answer is that we do not know. We do not know because the ocean is too large and too deep and too poorly explored for us to say with certainty what it does or does not contain. We do not know because the geological and archaeological evidence that would definitively resolve the question has not yet been found. We do not know because the question itself sits at the intersection of mythology and archaeology and geology and oceanography in ways that make it resistant to easy resolution. But we know more than we did. We know that the ocean has swallowed real cities, cities that we have found and explored and documented. We know that sea level rise since the last glacial maximum has inundated vast areas of coastal land that were once inhabited. We know that geological catastrophes, earthquakes and tsunamis and volcanic eruptions have destroyed coastal settlements throughout human history and prehistory. We know that the conventional timeline of human civilizational development has been revised repeatedly and dramatically by new archaeological discoveries that push the evidence of human social complexity further and further back in time. And we know that the deep ocean floor, largely unexplored, may contain evidence of a past that we have not yet had the technology, the resources, or perhaps the will to fully investigate. The search for Atlantis, in its most serious and rigorous forms, is not a search for the literal truth of Plato's philosophical dialogue. It is a search for the evidence of human activity in the deep past, in the places where that evidence is most likely to have been preserved and least likely to have been found. It is a search that is motivated by the recognition that the ocean is the world's largest archive of human and natural history, and that we have barely begun to read it. Every expedition that descends into the deep water with cameras and sensors and sampling equipment is adding a page to that archive, filling in the picture of a past that was, until recently, almost entirely invisible to us. And occasionally, those expeditions find something that changes everything. They find a new species that forces a revision of our understanding of deep-sea biology. They find a shipwreck that rewrites our knowledge of ancient trade routes. They find a submerged city that challenges our assumptions about when and where human civilization began. The ocean keeps its secrets well, but it does not keep them forever. In the final stretch of our journey, let us return to the living ocean, to the extraordinary ongoing geological processes that remind us that the world we live in is not static, not finished, not a completed product, but an ongoing creation. The volcanoes that build the ocean floor and the seamounts that rise from the deep are not merely features of past geological history. They are active, current, ongoing forces of geological change, and the monitoring of these forces, the scientific effort to understand and predict the behavior of the ocean's geological systems, is one of the most important and in some ways most urgent scientific endeavors of our time. We talked earlier about axial seamount and the extraordinary monitoring infrastructure that has been deployed around it. But axial seamount is just one node in a much larger network of geological observation that covers the ocean floor around the world. Seismometers placed on the seafloor monitor the constant low-level seismic activity of the mid-ocean ridges and the subduction zones. Pressure sensors on the seafloor track the slow inflation and deflation of magma chambers beneath underwater volcanoes. Chemical sensors monitor changes in the composition of the water that signal changes in hydrothermal activity. And increasingly sophisticated arrays of hydrophones listen to the ocean's acoustic environment for the distinctive sounds of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and other geological events. This global network of ocean floor observation is producing a picture of the Earth's internal dynamics in real time, a picture that is transforming our understanding of how the planet works and how its geological systems interact. The ocean floor is not merely the basement of the ocean. It is a window into the Earth's interior, a surface through which the deep processes of the planet are expressed and can be observed. Every earthquake recorded by the seafloor seismometers, every eruption tracked by the hydrophone arrays, every change in vent chemistry detected by the chemical sensors adds to a growing body of data that is helping scientists understand the geological machinery that drives the slow, relentless motion of the tectonic plates, the process that has shaped the continents and the ocean basins and the geography of the world over billions of years. And in understanding these processes better, we are also developing a better understanding of the risks they pose to human civilization. The tsunamis generated by undersea earthquakes and volcanic eruptions are among the most powerful and destructive natural disasters in the human experience. They have killed hundreds of thousands of people in recorded history and have reshaped coastlines and destroyed coastal communities around the world. Understanding where and when they are likely to occur and improving the warning systems that can give coastal communities time to evacuate before the waves arrive is one of the most practically important applications of deep ocean monitoring. There is a poignancy to all of this ocean exploration that deserves to be acknowledged. We are looking in all these expeditions and investigations for the evidence of what has been lost, the cities that sank, the ships that went down, the civilizations that the water swallowed. And in doing so, we are engaged in a form of mourning as much as a form of discovery, a recognition that the ocean has taken things from us that we cannot fully get back, that the past is not merely past but present in the traces it has left on the ocean floor, waiting to be found by those who know how to look. The people of Pavlopetri built their city and lived their lives in its streets and courtyards without any knowledge that the sea would eventually claim it. The passengers of the Titanic boarded the ship in high spirits, looking forward to their lives on the other side of the ocean, with no thought that the ocean would claim them instead. The sailors of the Nuestra Señora de Atocha left Havana in the September of 1622, with no premonition that the silver in the hold would lie on the ocean floor for 3.5 centuries before anyone came to retrieve it. The people of Port Royal went about their business on the morning of June 7, 1692, without any sense that within hours the ground beneath them would give way and the harbor would swallow their city. The ocean does not warn, it does not announce its intentions. It simply takes and keeps and preserves in the cold and the dark what it has taken. And then after years or decades or centuries or millennia, the divers come, the ROVs descend. The cameras light up the darkness, and the things that were lost come briefly back into the light. The gold bars from the Atocha, stacked on the seafloor for 363 years, glittered in the divers' lights as if they had been polished that morning. The shoes of the Titanic's passengers lie undisturbed on the ocean floor, their shapes preserved in the sediment even as the leather has dissolved, ghostly imprints of feet that stood on that deck on a cold April night more than a century ago. The streets of Pavlopetri are still navigable in the imagination, the walls still rising from the seafloor, the city plan still legible to those who know how to read it. These things endure, not perfectly, not forever, but far longer than anything on the surface of the earth. The ocean is the world's best archivist, and what it has archived is the material evidence of human life and human civilization across the full span of our species' time on Earth. Every expedition into the deep water is a voyage into that archive. Every discovery is a page recovered from the record of who we have been and what we have made and what we have lost. The search for Atlantis will continue. It always has and it always will, because the legend of Atlantis is not merely a legend about a lost city. It is a legend about human potential and human hubris, about the greatness that civilization can achieve and the fragility of everything we build. It is a story about the relationship between human ambition and natural power, between what we can create and what the earth can take away. And it resonates so deeply and so persistently in the human imagination, not because people are credulous or foolish, but because it speaks to something real about the human condition, the knowledge that everything we build is temporary, that the sea is patient, and that what rises can always fall. Whether Atlantis was a real place or a philosophical construct or a mythologized memory of a much simpler catastrophe, the search for it has led us to some of the most extraordinary discoveries in the history of exploration. It has driven people into the deep ocean and into remote deserts and into dusty archives in pursuit of evidence that the past was different from what we assume. And some of those people have found things, not Atlantis perhaps, but real cities on the seafloor. Real treasures from the bottom of the sea, real evidence of human habitation in places where no one expected to find it, real geological formations of extraordinary beauty and mystery, real creatures of such strangeness that they challenge every assumption we have ever made about life and where it can exist and what form it can take. The ocean is vast, our knowledge of it is limited. The floor of the sea holds secrets that we have not yet discovered, histories we have not yet uncovered, treasures we have not yet found. The Titanic is slowly dissolving into the chemistry of the deep Atlantic. The ruins of Pavlopetri are being gradually obscured by shifting sediment. The emeralds of the Atocha lie in museums and private collections, torn at last from the ocean floor after 3 centuries of waiting. The eye of the Sahara stares up at the sky from the heart of the desert, its concentric rings unchanged and unchanging, indifferent to the question of whether they are natural or artificial or something in between. And somewhere, perhaps in the waters around the Azores, perhaps in the Caribbean, perhaps in the Black Sea, or in the shallow coastal waters of some continent's continental shelf, there may be evidence of what Plato described, a civilization of extraordinary sophistication. A maritime empire of remarkable power, a city of concentric rings and gleaming temples and bustling harbors, swallowed by the sea in a single terrible day and night, preserved in the cold and the darkness, waiting for the day when someone finally comes with the right technology and the right knowledge and the right combination of stubbornness and luck to find it. We have not found it yet, but we are still looking. And the ocean is large and deep and full of wonders that we have not yet imagined. Every expedition that descends into the deep water carries with it the possibility of that discovery. Every sonar survey, every ROV dive, every carefully planned and meticulously executed archaeological investigation of a submerged site is one more step in the longest treasure hunt in human history. Not a hunt for gold or silver, though those have been found in abundance. A hunt for knowledge, a hunt for the truth about the past. A hunt for the answer to the question that Plato planted in the human imagination more than 2,000 years ago, and that has never, in all the intervening centuries, been satisfactorily answered. Is Atlantis real? The ocean knows, the ocean has always known, and the ocean, patient and vast and indifferent to human urgency, is not yet ready to tell us. But the divers are in the water, the submersibles are descending. The cameras are on and the sensors are recording and the sonar is sweeping the seafloor with its invisible sound. The search is ongoing, the archive is enormous, and the next discovery, the discovery that changes everything, the discovery that finally answers the question or reveals a new one even greater, could be anywhere. It could be in the next sonar return from the seafloor. It could be in the next frame of the ROV's camera. It could be in the papers of the next expedition to the waters around the Azores, or in the analysis of the next sample dredged from the floor of the Black Sea, or in the testimony of the next diver who descends to the warm, shallow, transparent waters of the Bahamas and swims along the line of limestone blocks that may or may not be the work of human hands. The ocean is waiting. It has been waiting for 11,500 years, or 5,000 years, or 300 years, depending on which mystery you are trying to solve. It will continue to wait, but the people who are looking are getting closer. The technology is getting better. The knowledge is accumulating. The picture of the past is getting clearer. And somewhere in the deep water, in the cold and the dark and the crushing pressure of the abyss, the truth is preserved and waiting. The greatest archive in the world, written in stone and bone and gold and silver and the crystal lattices of ancient minerals, sealed under miles of water, patient as the geological forces that shape the ocean floor itself. We are going deeper. We are looking harder. We are listening more carefully to what the ocean is telling us, and one day, perhaps soon, the ocean will answer. Somewhere beneath the surface of our oceans, rivers, and seas, the past is waiting to be rediscovered. Ancient cities swallowed by the tides, shipwrecks carrying fortunes beyond imagination, geological formations that defy all explanation, and creatures so strange they seem to belong to another world entirely. The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet's surface, and yet we have explored less than 20% of it. What lies in the remaining depths is a question that has haunted explorers, scientists, historians, and dreamers for thousands of years. And perhaps no mystery has captured the human imagination more powerfully, more persistently, or more passionately than the legend of a civilization so advanced, so magnificent, so utterly extraordinary that its destruction still echoes across the millennia. We are talking, of course, about Atlantis, but this is not simply a story about one lost city. This is the story of all the lost worlds that time and water have swallowed whole. This is the story of the civilizations that rose and fell before recorded history even began, of the ships that carried empires across the seas only to be claimed by the ocean floor, of the natural wonders that exist in places no human eye has ever seen, and of the dedicated, passionate, sometimes obsessed men and women who have devoted their lives to pulling these secrets back from the deep. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to journey to the bottom of the ocean and to the edge of human knowledge. We are going to explore sunken cities on the floor of the Mediterranean Sea, carved stone structures beneath the waters of the Caribbean, a mysterious circular formation in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and the frozen shores of Antarctica. We are going to descend into the crushing darkness where hydrothermal vents blast superheated water into the ocean, and where creatures live that should not, by any reasonable scientific understanding, be able to survive at all. And we are going to chase the greatest treasure ever recovered from the sea floor, a fortune in gold and silver and emeralds that lay on the bottom of the ocean for over 300 years before one remarkable man refused to stop looking for it. So take a deep breath. The water is rising and the journey begins now. Let us start at the very beginning with the story that started everything. The legend of Atlantis. And to understand the legend properly, we need to go back to where it all began, not with some ancient tablet, not with a mysterious inscription carved into a cave wall, but with one of the most celebrated and influential thinkers in the entire history of human civilization. we need to go back to Plato. Plato was born in Athens around 428 BCE, and over the course of his long life, he produced some of the most remarkable philosophical writings the world has ever seen. He is the reason we still think about justice and beauty and the nature of reality in the ways that we do. He is the father of what we call Western philosophy, and his influence on science, politics, ethics, and art is so vast and so deep that it is almost impossible to fully measure. But among all the extraordinary things Plato wrote and taught and believed, perhaps none has had a longer shadow than a story he included in two of his dialogues, works known as the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BCE. In these dialogues, Plato describes a conversation in which an Athenian statesman named Solon is told a remarkable tale by Egyptian priests. The priests, who Plato characterizes as keepers of ancient records going back far beyond the memory of the Greeks, describe a great island civilization that existed 9,000 years before their own time, an island empire that sat in the ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is what the ancient world called the Strait of Gibraltar. This civilization, the priests tell Solon, was a naval power of extraordinary sophistication. Its people were the descendants of the god Poseidon himself. They had built a magnificent capital city on a series of concentric rings of land and water, a city of gleaming temples and vast harbors, of exotic animals including elephants, of metals and minerals found nowhere else on Earth, of a society so wealthy and so powerful that it had launched a military campaign to conquer the entire Mediterranean world. Only the Athenians, the priests claim, had stood against this empire and defeated it. And then in a single terrible day and night, the gods had punished the Atlanteans for their arrogance and corruption, and the entire island had sunk beneath the sea. Gone, swallowed whole, lost forever beneath the waves of what Plato called the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the debate over whether Plato intended this story as literal historical fact, as philosophical allegory, or as something in between has raged for over 2,000 years. Some scholars insist that Plato invented Atlantis entirely, that it was a literary device designed to illustrate his philosophical ideas about the corrupting nature of wealth and power and imperial ambition. Others argue just as passionately that where there is smoke, there is fire, that a story this specific, this detailed, this geographically and culturally rich simply could not have been invented from nothing, that somewhere behind the legend there must be a kernel of genuine historical memory. And then there is a third group, the explorers and the researchers and the dedicated investigators who have spent decades in the field and underwater and in dusty archives, and who believe not just that Atlantis existed, but that they have found it, or at least found compelling evidence of where it might be. The search for Atlantis has taken people to some of the most remarkable places on Earth. And we are going to follow that search today, beginning with one of the most intriguing and often overlooked candidates for the location of the lost civilization, a remote archipelago sitting alone in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, 900 miles from the nearest continental coast. The Azores, 9 islands rising from the surface of the Atlantic like the tips of submerged mountains, because that is precisely what they are. Formed by volcanic activity over millions of years, these islands sit at the point where 3 of the Earth's great tectonic plates meet, a junction of geological forces so powerful that the islands themselves are still being shaped by volcanic eruptions and earthquakes to this day. The Azores are Portuguese territory, beautiful and remote, a world of green hills dropping into black volcanic rock and then into the deep blue of the Atlantic. And for many Atlantis researchers, they represent something even more significant than a beautiful island chain. They represent a clue. The argument for the Azores as the remnants of Atlantis begins with geography. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. The Azores are in the Atlantic Ocean, but the argument goes much deeper than simple location. When researchers began looking at the underwater geography of the region around the Azores, they found something genuinely remarkable. The islands themselves, those 9 visible peaks rising above the waterline, are merely the highest points of a massive underwater plateau, an elevated section of the mid-Atlantic ridge that in geological terms is extraordinarily close to the surface. If you were to lower the level of the Atlantic Ocean significantly, or if this plateau were to have been elevated above sea level in the distant past and then subsequently submerged, you would have exactly the kind of large landmass that Plato describes. The mid-Atlantic ridge itself is one of the most dramatic geological features on the entire planet. Running for roughly 10,000 miles from north to south through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, it marks the boundary between the tectonic plates that carry the continents of Europe and Africa on one side and the continents of the Americas on the other. The ridge is essentially a continuous mountain range running along the ocean floor, formed by the constant upwelling of magma from deep within the earth. It is the site of enormous geological activity, of volcanic eruptions, of earthquakes, of the slow but relentless movement of the Earth's crustal plates. The Azores sit right at the intersection of three of these plates, making them one of the most geologically active places on Earth. Now here is where the Atlantis connection becomes genuinely compelling for those who study it. Plato described Atlantis as sinking beneath the sea in a single catastrophic event. Geological science tells us that dramatic land subsidence events, where large areas of land drop below sea level due to volcanic or tectonic activity, are not only possible but have happened many times throughout Earth's history. The question is whether any such event occurred in the region of the Azores within anything resembling a time frame that would be relevant to the legend. And this is where researchers have found evidence that continues to generate debate. Various studies of the geology of the Azores and the surrounding seafloor have identified evidence of significant past geological events in the region, including periods of volcanic activity and land elevation changes that might have dramatically altered the landscape of the area. Some researchers have pointed to underwater features in the vicinity of the Azores that they argue look remarkably like geological formations that have been submerged, plateaus and ridges, and underwater escarpments that might once have been above sea level. One of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence in the Azores-Atlantis connection involves a sample of tachylite, a form of basaltic lava that forms only when lava cools rapidly in the open air, as opposed to underwater. This sample, dredged from the ocean floor near the Azores, seemed to suggest that at some point in the past, the area from which it was retrieved had been exposed above sea level and had experienced aerial lava flows. If that was the case, it meant there had once been more land in this region than exists today. However, subsequent geological analysis has complicated this picture significantly, and many scientists now argue that the interpretation of such samples is far more complex than early Atlantis researchers assumed. But the geological argument is only part of the case for the Azores. There is also the matter of what Plato specifically wrote about the location of Atlantis. He described it as an island or series of islands sitting in front of what he called the true ocean, the great body of water that he believed surrounded all the continents. He specifically said it was situated beyond the straits near the Pillars of Hercules, placing it in the Atlantic proper. He also described Atlantis as having been a gateway to other islands, and from those islands one could reach the opposite continent that surrounds the true ocean. Many Atlantis researchers have pointed out that this description, read without preconceptions, sounds remarkably like someone describing the Azores as stepping stones across the Atlantic. But the Azores Hypothesis has its critics, and their criticisms are serious. The most fundamental problem is the timeline. Plato explicitly stated that Atlantis sank 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would place the destruction of Atlantis at roughly 11,500 years ago, well within human history, but at the very tail end of the last ice age, a period when global sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today, and when the geography of the world looked very different. For the Azores to have been a large landmass at that time, we would need evidence of significantly more exposed land in the region than the geological record currently confirms. The rise in sea levels that followed the end of the last ice age was substantial, perhaps as much as 400 feet in some regions, but that is still not enough to explain the complete submersion of a continent-sized island in the area of the Azores. The islands are still there, after all. They did not sink. They remained, which would seem to argue against the idea that this was the site of a dramatic, total submersion event. And yet, and this is the detail that keeps Atlantis researchers coming back to the Azores again and again, Plato did not necessarily describe a continent. He described a large island, and he described that island sinking. What if the Azores represent not the remnants of the sunken island, but the highest peaks of what was once a much larger and more expansive island group, most of which is now beneath the water? It is not an unreasonable question, and it is one that continues to drive exploration and research in the region to this day. The search for Atlantis in the waters around the Azores has involved underwater surveys, sonar mapping of the seafloor, and careful geological analysis. And while no definitive proof of a sunken civilization has yet been found, the researchers who have studied this region most closely argue that the search is far from over. The ocean here is deep, the conditions are often treacherous, and the area to be searched is vast. The Azores, they say, have not given up all their secrets yet. But the Azores are not the only place where people have looked for Atlantis, and they are not even the most surprising. For that, we need to travel in an entirely different direction, not out to sea, but deep into the heart of a continent. Specifically, deep into the heart of Africa, to one of the most inhospitable and least visited places on the entire surface of the earth. We are going to the Sahara Desert. The Sahara stretches across the northern portion of Africa for nearly 3.5 million square miles, making it the largest hot desert on Earth and one of the most extreme environments our planet offers. Temperatures regularly exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Rainfall in many areas is measured not in inches per year, but in decades between showers. The landscape